Testing audio 1 2 3 4. Testing audio. Welcome to the broadcast. Sorry, I forgot to press the live button earlier. Testing audio 1 2 3 4. Testing audio. We're back to OBS here. Sorry about that. Just want to make sure everything's set up here. Sorry, I forgot to press the live button. Sounds like the audio is okay. I did turn my microphone down because it's been picking up really hot lately for some reason. So I did turn it down. Thank you for the 2 likes, guys. Audio is good. Picture is okay. All that good stuff. I do want to make some adjustments later on in the next couple of weeks, Charles, with you, just to, you know, for example, like when I go to scene 2, I kind of want the picture of me to be a little bit bigger. But it looks pretty good now. Let me just see how it's picking up here. Sounds and looks good. What's up, Liz? Thank you for joining us. What's up, Neo? Nexus, we got Neo in the chat. Thank you for joining us. Gonna wait for a couple more souls to show up if they may. And then we'll get started. We got a really interesting, really creepy show planned for you guys this evening. We'll be talking about 3 occult horror novels. Should be really interesting. I am going to try to pay a little more attention to the chat this evening, just to make things a little more interactive. But, you know, as usual, I'll be talking and have my nose buried in the chat. We can work on that. Cool. Hey, what's up, Marissa? I really enjoyed the overload of content from you and Charles today. It was really nice to see you guys out and about. I'm going to put these scissors away before I cut my finger off. So yeah, I hope everybody's having a good end of October. I can't believe it's October 23rd already, but we are heading towards the end of October as it is, sort of transitioning into really late fall into the early winter. And I've sort of, you know, like I curate my reading list or my reading schedule sort of a little bit seasonally. Like this year, obviously, like what the stream is going to be about is 3 horror novels that we chose, and that's a good way to, you know, put yourself in the mindset with different seasons. And, you know, of course there's the whole astrological aspect too. I'm not really very well versed on that, but I definitely think that plays a role in, you know, our moods and all that kind of stuff too. Let's just check one thing here. Let's try to get to 5 likes here. Might not even be 5 people here. I don't think there is, but I'm going to wait another minute. Crack open this drink. Hopefully I don't look too much like an academic drag queen with this outfit on. That was really funny when somebody said Jordan Peterson looks like an academic drag queen. All right, so I think we will get started here. Does anybody realize that they updated the YouTube app? So everything is like up here now, and they're always switching things. You have to read Christmas books. Yeah, I actually got one. Let me show it to you real quick. Hey, we're working on this Shakespeare book. I'm not going to talk too much about that now, but we do have A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is like the quintessential Christmas book, and I think it does have some esoteric themes that we could probably dovetail, you know, with sort of occult literature and stuff like that. You look like an academic try-hard. Well, it's either an academic try-hard or an academic drag queen, one of the two. That was like the most hilarious thing I've ever heard. Academic drag queen, because Jordan Peterson, he wears these elbow patches. So anyway, so we do have a new feature. If you guys go to the description, as well as some other people in the chat will be assisting me. I am accepting donations. My channel is not monetized, so please feel free during the stream or at the end of the stream, if you're enjoying the content, please feel free to donate. No pressure, but just a new feature, a little thing we're trying out tonight. I have my PayPal link as well as my Cash App link. So whatever app works better for you guys. I noticed that they updated YouTube. The comments are now on the bottom. Well, yeah, I'm not really sure about that part. But I was talking more about like when you're on the actual app. Like, I don't know, maybe nobody else got the update, but when you guys get the update, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a little bit confusing. That's what I was doing when we first started the stream. That's what was taking up so much time. I was trying to figure out what was what and all that stuff. Well, let's get started, folks. I really appreciate everybody joining. Looks like we got 8 people in the chat. Now, this probably will be fairly long-winded. I'm planning on maybe 2 or 3 hours. We may go that long. We may not. We may go longer. But the first hour is going to be geared towards The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And then probably the second half an hour, the first half an hour, like I said, we're going to split up the first hour between these 2 novels. Second half an hour is going to be The Howling. And lastly but not leastly, we're going to save the best for last, which is The Entity. What's up, Jay? Thank you for joining us. Long time no see. Trying to remember or figure out who you were, but I'll figure it out at some point. Thank you for joining, guys. I really appreciate it. So we're going to save this for last. Please stick around for The Entity because I have some, video interviews and stuff that we're going to be sort of, featuring for this live stream to sort of, get more information out of this text. So let's talk a little bit about Shirley Jackson. We have a little picture of her here. This particular headline says, Shirley Jackson, possibly a witch, definitely played the zither, which is sort of like a medieval harp or something. I'm not sure what the harp has to do with being a witch. Maybe it's an esoteric instrument of sorts. But I sort of picked up this novel a while back. Hold on a second. Somebody said one of my links is not working. Where does the link go, Charles? Let me know where it goes so we can fix that. I can take that out of the stream probably. I don't want to do it here, but I'll figure it out at some point. Where's that link taking you? Trying to figure out some technical difficulties here with some of the donation links. I don't want to send you guys to the wrong spot. Looks like my brother's answering me here, hopefully. Just goes to the PayPal homepage. Okay, we'll stick with Cash App for now. I really don't feel like messing with it, but let's hope the Cash App link works. Let me know if it doesn't work. I'm pretty sure the Cash App link is pretty solid. We'll deal with the PayPal link next time, and I'll make an edit when this is over. And we will, I'm going to turn my phone on silent too until people are ready to call. Okay, so we're going to stick with Cash App. And maybe if people prefer PayPal, we'll work on that later. I'll fix the link and I'll put it up in the description. So let's talk a little bit about Shirley Jackson. We're going to spend the next half an hour, hopefully, I'm probably going to go a little longer than that, on The Haunting of Hill House. It's a pretty short novel, but it's full of esoteric themes, full of the occult. I'm not like an expert in Shirley Jackson or anything like that, but there is some stuff in the introduction that did stand out to me. She sort of had a lifelong interest in the occult. Her father and her parents, were really interested in the paranormal and stuff like that. But we also have stuff like Jackson, who had a lifelong interest in the occult, who dabbled in spells and liked to tell reporters that she was a witch, professed to believe in ghosts. So, I would have to look more into Shirley Jackson to sort of figure out how much of this is actually true, but she's sort of baiting the media that she's a witch, right? So we have a lot of speculation there that we could sort of delve into, which I think is really interesting. And just a little bit more about her background, if I can kind of find it here. She's actually, I don't think she was born here, but she did go to college. It says here, Jackson's parents moved the family east to Rochester, New York, which is not far from where Charles and I actually grew up. So I thought that was interesting when Shirley was in high school. After a disastrous stint at the nearby University of Rochester, she finally began to establish her independence at Syracuse University. My dad actually taught at Syracuse University, so very small world, just really interesting connections there. And then she went to Vermont. But there is, let's see here, There is some other connections, I think, with her parents, possible military-industrial complex references. I'm not going to get too far into that. But just a little anecdote here from the introduction. The Haunting of Hill House is laced with broken, destructive families with particular emphasis on volatile relations between women. And there is some sort of underlying lesbian themes between two of the main protagonists, that being Eleanor as well as Theodora. And what's interesting about all of these books, in fact, and I think it's brilliant that I just kind of by happenstance chose to read all these three books. There is an underlying theme of sexual tension and repressed sexuality. Now, The Haunting of Hill House is the only one that's written by a woman. The other two are written by male authors. So we will sort of maybe discuss some of the... Hey, Clarice, thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to have you in the chat. We got my buddy Clarice here, coming all the way from Spain. We got Mark. So we are going to, like I said, be discussing these books. But I do think it's interesting that there is... these books, they're quite different, but they're all linked with this underlying theme of sexual tension, and it gets darker as these novels kind of progress. But let's start hacking away at The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson here. It is a haunted house novel, a haunted house narrative, but it's also a bunch of other things too. Like it's not in the vein of The Conjuring or like Hereditary or anything like that. The hauntings, it is a little bit, but the hauntings are more psychological, right? Because when there's several individuals, several main characters in this novel, but the ones that are sort of belabored the most, I would say, is definitely Eleanor. And I don't want to give too many spoilers, but this channel is full of spoilers, and in order to sort of get as much information out of the text, sometimes we have to delve into the plot. But my analysis is not going to be super plot based. It's going to be more based on the themes, I would say, and just sort of my personal speculation about things. You could talk till the cows go home about the plot, but that doesn't really help you get to the underlying themes. So basically, make a long story short, I'll try to keep this kind of short. You should be a literature teacher. Maybe. I'm studying art history, so maybe we'll dovetail some of this at some point. But basically, Shirley Jackson here. Let me know in the chat if anybody knows anything else about her. But sort of an esoteric figure, right? Sort of a in the shadows type of figure. She has extensive knowledge about Ouija boards and, planchette, I think it's called, and, obviously the occult, ghost stories, and there is sort of a religious theme to this, and you could maybe there's references to not only Christianity, but also, different pagan sects and stuff like that. But I think to sort of start this particular analysis of, I'll tell you a little bit about the plot. Basically, there's this guy named Dr. Montague, an occult scholar looking for solid evidence of psychic phenomena. Then we have Theodora, his lovely and lighthearted assistant, and there's nothing romantic there. He does have a wife, and she shows up later, and she's quite an interesting character. And then we have this guy called Luke that doesn't particularly stand out, but he sort of serves as this, sort of individual in the middle of Theodora and Eleanor, sort of keeping things lighthearted, but he's also kind of a source of tension between those two characters. And then lastly, Eleanor, a friendless, fragile young woman with a dark past. As they begin to cope with chilling, even horrifying occurrences beyond their control or understanding, they cannot possibly know what lies ahead. So going into this book, you think it's going to be like some jump scare, slasher, horror, haunted house book, right? And it does have some of those elements, but like I said, the haunting is really psychological. And the first part of the book basically opens up with Dr. Montague. Finally made it to a live stream. Looking forward to some ghost stories. Me too. I'm really looking forward to that too. That's an interesting question, Mark D'Angelo, but it's not really related to this. We could discuss that later or something, or at another time. So the first chapter opens up with Dr. Montague, and Dr. Montague is sort of like this occult, he's like the occult sort of mastermind, bringing all these other people together. And in some ways, he's kind of like the reason that several of these characters have problems, but he's not like a villain per se, but he is sort of like, he's like the occult mastermind. It says Dr. John Montague was a doctor of philosophy, had taken his degree in anthropology, feeling obscurely that in this field he might come closest to his true vocation, the analysis of supernatural manifestations. So we have this character, like I said, what type of doctor he is he's a doctor of philosophy, right? But he sort of carries himself as like an esoteric, scholar, right? He combed the records of the psychic societies, the back files of sensational newspapers, the reports of parapsychologists, and assembled a list of names of people who had, in one way or another, at one time or another, been involved in abnormal events. So there's definitely an underlying theme or a frequent reference to parapsychology. If you're not familiar with parapsychology, it's sort of like a really niche sort of paranormal genre of psychology. It's not taken seriously, obviously, but I do think it's an interesting endeavor, the whole idea of parapsychology. It's mostly been defrocked or debunked, right? But it is an interesting world to kind of delve into. The purpose of their stay, the letters stated clearly, was to observe and explore the various unsavory stories which have been circulated about the house for most of its 80 years of existence. Dr. Montague sent out a bunch of letters to most of the people that he knew or trusted that would be interested in, staying at a haunted house, right? So the ones that he chooses are the ones that end up showing up is Eleanor, who was 32 years old when she came to Hill House. The only person in the world she genuinely hated now that her mother was dead was her sister. So we go back to this Eleanor character, and she's pretty much sort of the victim of the novel, right? And she's been taking care of her elderly sick mother for over 11 years or something like that. And so she's very deranged. And this is like her first experience being out of the house. And the first couple of chapters document the tension of Eleanor and her family, and they're almost keeping her under like a conservatorship of sorts. It's never really explained. But she's like under a lot of pressure from her family. She's been taking care of her mother her whole life. And going to Hill House is like a big deal for her because it's like the one and only thing she's pretty much done, right? She's not married. She does have a sister, but her sister and, her sister's husband kind of control her every move. And there's arguments over who's going to take the car. But finally, Eleanor, sister, somehow she gets granted permission to take the car to Hill House. And then this other character, Theodora, is introduced. Theodora, that was as much a name as she used. Her sketches were signed Theo. And that's another interesting part of this novel is that Eleanor refers to Theodora as Theo. So what does that exactly mean? It could mean a couple of different elements, but it's almost a way of sort of masculinizing this Eleanor, let's see here. Yeah, Theodora. So Eleanor calls this other woman Theodora. She refers to her as Theo, and it's almost a way of sort of giving her a masculine, how do I say, like a masculine, not an avatar, but sort of a masculine personification, perhaps in sort of for the purpose of justifying her sexual attraction to her or to each other, right? That's just sort of my speculation. But she signed her letters Theo, and on her apartment door and in the window of her shop and her telephone listing and her pale stationery, the bottom of the lovely photograph of her which stood on the mantel, the name was always only Theodora. So Theodora refers to herself as Theodora, but other people for some reason address her as Theo. So that's all you really need to know as far as that goes. Theodora's world was one of delight and soft colors. She had come to know Dr. Montague because going into the laboratory, bringing with her a rush of floral perfume, she had somehow been amused and excited over her own incredible skill to identify correctly 18 cards out of 20, 15 cards out of 20, and 19 cards out of 20. So there's a little bit of esoteric numbers going on there, some, maybe numerology, held up by an assistant out of sight and hearing. So, but they're also referring to, they were sort of trying to rehabilitate maybe a deaf person or like a deaf mute or something like that. Theodora, which told her the names, let's see here, Perhaps the wakened knowledge in Theodora, which told her the names of symbols on cards held out of sight, urged her on her way to Hill House. So anyway, they're just sort of giving you a little background on some of these characters. And then they introduce Luke. It says Luke Sanderson was a liar. He was also a thief. His aunt, who was the owner of Hill House, was found of pointing out that her nephew had the best education, blah, blah, blah. So he's sort of like a bougie type guy or whatever, even though it's not really true. Someday Luke would inherit Hill House, but he had never thought to find himself living in it. So all these characters, it almost reminds me of The Shining or something too, because they sort of all end up in this haunted house, and it's almost like there's something maybe reoccurring within time. Like whoever lives at Hill House, there's something in the text that alludes to whoever lives at Hill House or whoever is at Hill House walks alone, and stuff like that. The Sightings documentary had lots of paranormal investigators interviewed on it. Yeah, we're actually going to delve into that, some of the interviews with Carrie Gaynor from the Entity case. So that's going to be really great. So the novel kind of unfolds. Theodora shows up, Eleanor shows up, Luke shows up, right? And then Dr. Montague, of course, is like the occult mastermind. So this book is definitely a slow burn, okay? Nothing really particularly interesting happens. I mean, there's interesting rabbit holes to go down with the different conversations that take place. But really the meat and the potatoes of the novel doesn't really happen until halfway through. And it's sort of like a slow burn a horror movie. But chapter 2 starts out, no human eye can isolate the unhappy coincidence of line and place which suggests evil in the face of a house, and yet somehow a maniac juxtaposition, a badly turned angle, some chance meeting of roof and sky turned Hill House into a place of despair, more frightening because the face of Hill House seemed awake with a watchfulness from the blank windows. So there's almost this idea of the house being alive, right? I don't think I have to explain that too much, but it's not in the house is not haunted by demons or ghosts or like, it's more of sort of like a poltergeist, but like I said before, the hauntings come from within the people's psyche, and there are voices being heard. There's some furniture being moved around. They have some, spirits knocking on the door, but it's not like the typical ghost story of like seeing, a ghost shrouded in white, perhaps clanking some chains or something. That's much more psychological, which I think is interesting. So it says little things like this. The door opened without warning, and she was looking at a woman who, if ever, so this is basically Mrs. Dudley, and she's the servant. She's kind of like the least important character, but she's actually pretty important because she's like this specter, and she basically reiterates to all these characters that she does not. She leaves Hill House at night. What does she say here? She says, I set dinner on the dining room sideboard at 6 o'clock sharp. So the number 6, you can serve yourselves. I clean up in the morning. I have breakfast ready for you at 9 o'clock. That's the way I agreed to do. I can't keep the rooms up the way you'd like, but there's no one else you could get that would help me. I don't wait on people. What I agreed to, it doesn't mean I wait on people. So just very strange. And then she goes on to say, I leave. Let me see here. Mrs. Dudley went on. And it basically says, after it gets dark, I don't stay after it gets dark. I leave before dark comes. We live over in the town 6 miles away. So this maid, obviously, now the maid, you could take the maid for maybe a potential spirit or a potential entity herself, but really I think the maid is very well aware, if she is a real person. I would assume Shirley Jackson wants her to be a real person. The maid is almost aware of what Hill House does to people, but for some reason, this Mrs. Dudley character works in collaboration with the entities at Hill House, which is kind of creepy, and you can't really trust this Mrs. Dudley character. But somebody else that you can't really trust is Thea as Eleanor. She's not really a reliable narrator because she's kind of resentful, and we don't really know if she's mentally ill, if she's sort of losing, her mind and stuff like that. But so I would say the narration is definitely told from Eleanor's point of view, but we also get sort of like this omnipresent narrator type thing sort of fused in. That is creepy. The haunting is there psychologically rather than the property. Yeah, but it's a little bit of both too, you know what I mean? Clarice Williams says House was a personality, perhaps from the inhibitions past and current. Yeah, absolutely, Clarice. Very much in the lieu of Stanley Kubrick, The Shining, or something like that. Neo Nexus says watched the TV show a couple years ago, but I never read the book. Yeah, you definitely should read it. And the best version of this movie, I actually watched it last night, is the one from 1963, and it's called The Haunting. It definitely helped me to kind of understand the story a little bit better. But this book is really complex. There's a lot of different levels, and we're not going to be able to touch upon all of them. And then Theodora meets Eleanor, and sort of right off the bat, there's little esoteric references like this. Eleanor chose a red sweater, thinking that in this room in the house, the red sweater and the red sandals brought to match, it would almost certainly be utterly at war with each other, although they had been close enough yesterday in the city. So I'm not sure. I think she's referring to the clothes. Serves me right anyway, she thought, for wanting to wear such things. I never did that. But why did she pick a red sweater? It's kind of interesting. There's a couple different ways you could extrapolate that. The color red has a lot of different meanings perhaps. So like I said, it is a slow burn, and also something else weird that just sort of occurs here in the novel is Theodore and Eleanor refer to each other as cousins. When they're talking to each other, they refer to each other as cousins. And then there's this other weird little sort of event that occurs on page 39. And basically what happens here, I want to make sure I get this right. So I think they're outside briefly from Hill House. Is that what's taking place here? Either that or they're looking out the window or something. But all of a sudden, I'll read this to you here. She sat up laughing. Hold on a second. Yeah, apparently the links for the Cash App are disappearing. So if you guys do want to donate to the Cash App, the link is in my description, and we'll talk about that later. But so frozen, shoulders pressed together, they stared, watching the spot of hillside across the brook where the grass moved, watching something unseen move slowly across the bright hills, chilling the sunlight and dancing in the little brook. What is it? Eleanor said. Theodore put a strong hand on her wrist. It's gone, Theodore said clearly, and the sun came back and it was warm again. It was a rabbit. And this theme of a rabbit being sighted occurs again and again. And I'm not sure exactly what they're referring to there with the rabbit, but it probably has a very strong significance. And I think what it could potentially be is sort of maybe the vulnerability and the innocence of a rabbit, or maybe the rabbit's a spirit or something. But if we end up getting into what happens to Theodore at the end of the book, it might be relevant to the rabbit. Let's see here. Okay, so then Luke Sanderson kind of shows up. But what I suspect, I actually wrote here in the text in the margin, is Luke a ghost? Because I think this character Luke, I haven't really told you that much about him, but I don't remember too much about him because he was not that he wasn't important, but it's almost like he's maybe not quite there. I assume he's definitely a real person. But his behavior sort of manifests itself as this person who kind of sneaks around, and he's always drinking martinis and stuff like that. So just a little quick recap. So we basically got all these 4 characters in a haunted house, and I kind of skipped over this part, but there is a pretty extensive history of Hill House, which might be important, that sort of gets revealed as the story progresses, but I want to focus on the main narrative here. Okay, so the first reference, or the first sighting of ghosts and apparitions, sort of occurs on page 48 to 49. Now, how does that manifest itself? The gates are locked. Hill House has a reputation for incessant hospitality. It seemingly dislikes letting its guests get away. The last person who tried to leave Hill House in the darkness, it was 18 years ago, I grant you, was killed at the turn of the driveway where his horse bolted and crushed him against the big tree. So that's kind of what I'm referring to. Like, the hauntings literally drive you crazy until you kill yourself. And that's, to me, is almost more frightening than just like seeing a bunch of ghosts or zombies running around, right? So that is an element to sort of, keep lots of activity at night. Clarice says yes. My brother says he was afraid to be in our house alone at night, and that's kind of, yeah. I mean, I think some people, we can all kind of relate to that. Now, Hill House is this novel is drawing on those emotions, those feelings, those experiences, but it's also mixing the occult with, a little bit of historical things that actually happened in the house. And it's not that she's sort of like riffing on it or making fun of it, but she is kind of like implementing a serious element to just the everyday corny haunted house book, right? So they're sitting around drinking brandy. It says, darkness lay in the corners, and the marble Cupid smiled down on them with chubby good humor. What a time for a ghost story, Theodore said. If you please, the doctor was stiff. We are not children trying to frighten one another, he says. Let us, said the doctor, exercise great caution in our language. Preconceived notions of ghosts and apparitions. And then somebody is making some jokes here. My dear boy, if you please, he's talking to Luke here, Dr. Montague. I was trying to explain that our purpose here, since it is of a scientific and exploratory nature, ought not to be affected, perhaps even warped by half-remembered spooky stories which belong more properly to a marshmallow roast. As a matter of fact, my researches over the past years have led me to certain theories regarding psychic phenomena, which I have now for the first time an opportunity of testing. Ideally, of course, you ought not to know anything about Hill House. You should be ignorant and receptive. So that's weird, like he's basically, and we also have this reference here. You will recall, the doctor began, the houses described in Leviticus as leprous, or Homer's phrase for the underworld, Adao Domas, the house of Hades. I need not remind you. I think that the concept of certain houses as unclean or forbidden, perhaps sacred, is as old as the mind of man. Certainly there are spots which inevitably attach themselves in an atmosphere of holiness and goodness. It might not then be too fanciful to say that some houses are born bad. Hill House, whatever the cause, has been unfit for human habitation for upward of 20 years. What it was like before then, whether its personality was molded by the people who lived there or the things they did, or whether it was evil from its start, are all questions I cannot answer. Naturally, I hope that we will all know a good deal more about Hill House. So Dr. Montague is sort of like spilling the beans, but he's like trying to convince these characters to stick around and, don't be afraid of every little bump in the night. But he's basically telling them that Hill House has a terrible reputation. And there's some references to, Homer's Odyssey as well as Leviticus. And we will see sort of that element, horror, occult juxtaposed with religious references. And there was something else I wanted to there's basically this idea of the house of lepers. I wrote up in the margins here that's one way you could sort of, take meaning out of this, is like it's a house of lepers, it's a haunted house, but we also have this idea of sort of like, as in the words of Carrie Gaynor, the parapsychologist, like a needle working on a phonograph, and that basically the previous experiences, the previous traumas of any given location sort of manifest themselves as this reoccurring thing, like a needle on a photograph. And that's kind of what's happening with this. Somebody says, I first heard about Hill House a year ago from a former tenant. He began by assuring me that he had left Hill House because his family objected to living so far out in the country. So basically they're just kind of speculating about Hill House. House has a personality, perhaps from the inhabitant. Okay, we read that one. My chat is a little bit delayed here, but and then they're sort of baiting each other. Like Eleanor and Theodora are saying, well, do you want to leave? And Theodora is saying, no, I don't want to leave. And she's saying, well, do you want to leave? And they're kind of, somebody says here, it's a horrible old house, and if I rented it, I'd scream for my money back. So this is just sort of what's the dialogue that's taking place. Many people died at Hill House. Now, the house was formerly owned by a man named Hugh Crane. And he left with two small daughters to bring up, but he did not leave Hill House. The second, Mrs. Crane, died of a fall, although I've been unable to ascertain how or why. Her death seems to have been as tragically unexpected as her predecessors. The third, Mrs. Crane, died of what they used to call consumption somewhere in Europe. There is, somewhere in the library, a collection of postcards sent to the two little girls left behind in Hill House from their father and their stepmother traveling from one health resort to another. So back in the early, sort of like the mid 1850s, all the way through the Victorian times, all the way till like the early 1930s, one of the biggest fears during that time was coming down with consumption. Thomas Wolfe writes extensively about consumption as well as tuberculosis, really terrible disease. Hill House was built 80 odd years ago. It was built as a home for his family by a man named Hugh Crane, a country home where he hoped to see his children and grandchildren live in comfortable luxury. Unfortunately, Hill House was a sad house almost from the beginning. So that's just a little history lesson on the history of Hill House. So let's see here. They had come through the darkness. This is on page 71. They had come through the darkness of one night. They had met morning in Hill House, and they were a family, greeting one another with easy informality and going to the chairs they had used last night at dinner, their own places at the table. "Did you really leave all the doors open for us?" Eleanor asked. "That's how we knew you were coming," Luke told her. "We saw the doors swing shut." "Today we will nail all the doors open," Theodore said. "I am going to pace this house until I can find food 10 minutes out of 10. I slept with my light on all night. Until about 3 when Pamela finally put me to sleep. There wasn't a sound until the rain started sometime after 2. One of you ladies called out in her sleep once." "That must have been me," Theodore said shamelessly, "dreaming about the wicked sister at the gates of Hill House." "I dreamed about her too," Eleanor said. She looked at the doctor and said, "Suddenly it's embarrassing to think about being afraid." So basically they're being haunted in their dreams by a couple of different entities. I bet these type of houses are creepy, definitely. "Foul, filthy house," Theodore said, rubbing her knee. "Good morning." So basically just some kind of run-of-the-mill conversations here, but this whole book, like every page is pretty much pregnant with meaning. And then they're kind of joking around about what it's like to be there, and that's sort of how they tame it's almost like when you're in the bad part of town or something, you start rationalizing to yourself, or you're out in the woods and you're creeped out, but you kind of rationalize to yourself. And that's what all of these characters are doing pretty much simultaneously. Lots of haunted places out on the East Coast, I can imagine. In Fayetteville, New York, the old library was haunted. Yeah, it was. That really was a really creepy place, almost like Hill House. That kind of reminds me, we could do a whole live stream just talking about some of our paranormal experiences. And the whole thing with the bunny that we mentioned, I don't think it's a real bunny. It's obviously some type of entity, or it's some illusion that's trying to lure some of these characters, particularly Eleanor, out of Hill House. There's a lot of different themes you could reference to the bunny, but I think it is some type of entity, because when I was in church one time, my brother remembers this. It was Christmas Eve, and we saw like this little white dog. And obviously there would be no dogs at the Christmas service. Nobody was bringing in. They didn't have emotional support animals back then, right? So, but it almost looked like Zero from The Nightmare Before Christmas. And I think that just kind of reminded me of this little entity here of the bunny. Now here's something else too. To relax from the oppressive atmosphere of the rest of the house, the deer-headed looked down on her mournfully. "Can we please take down the beast up there?" So there's basically like somebody was hunting in the house, and they like stuffed the head of a deer, right? So that's kind of creeping them out too. Now here's something none of you anticipated. He opened a small door tucked in beside the tall front door and stood back smiling. The library. So basically there's like little secret doorways, secret libraries, and I wrote here in the text, or in the sticky note, reminds me of the Winchester house. It definitely has a Winchester vibe to it. We're going a little over on our time with Hill House here, so we'll try to fast forward to what's important. So basically here the cold spots start to kind of occur. Um, so basically they're being haunted in their dreams. They're starting to hear voices, and there's also cold spots. That's like a classic paranormal sort of thing, right? The cold spot in Borley Rectory only dropped 11 degrees. This, I should think, is considerably colder, the heart of the house. So they're sort of making their way through this big, giant haunted house. Astral planning, yeah, or astral projection, yeah. That's definitely a possibility, Clarice. Very good information there. Thank you for sharing that. Like I said, like it's pregnant with meaning, and you could really interpret this in a lot of different ways. I appreciate you staying up late tonight, Clarice. Let me know what time it is there in Spain. So the humor in this book is sort of used as a way to, Shirley Jackson doesn't want to just give you constant horror, right? So it's brilliantly juxtaposed with some of this humorous stuff, and sort of the darkness and the esotericism comes out in the jokes of Dr. Montague and Luke and Theodora. But also here, the relationship between Theodora and Eleanor really starts to blossom, and they don't ever actually do anything. Like they don't like make love or anything like that. But there's not only a friendship, and they refer to each other as cousins, which is weird. And then Eleanor refers to Theodora as Theo, which is also kind of weird. There is an underlying affection there, borderline on female homosexuality. And it's interesting how, I suspect Shirley Jackson may have maybe been a closet lesbian. She was married, I think. But I think this was one of the ways she was able to express her potential lesbian affections for women. It's nearly 1:45 a.m. White rabbit means life transformation. Yeah, so really good, interesting stuff here. This is why I like having you guys in the chat, because you guys can kind of, help me out with this a little bit too. Here's another thing. Speaking of ghosts of dogs, Luke basically gets lost in this netherworld outside. Halfway through the book here, we're kind of getting towards the midpoint here. We were chasing a dog, Luke said, at least some animal like a dog. He stopped and went on reluctantly. We followed it outside. So there's this element of spirits, not only the house watching them, but there's like these animal spirits manifesting themselves, trying to bait them out of the house. Potentially, they are in collusion with the entities at the Hill House, but I also suspect that maybe the animal spirits are trying to get them the hell out of there. That's another possibility. So it's interesting. That's exactly what I saw, what I remember as a kid at the Christmas Eve service. Now, we were kind of at like an esoteric church. We were at the May Memorial Unitarian Universalist Society Church, right? So God knows what kind of Christmas entities were being evoked that evening. I mean, it was a beautiful service, and the energy in there was beautiful, but it was just a spirit of a dog. Maybe an old dog lived at the church, in the olden days or something. But this kind of stuff happens. Like people see spirits of dogs or bunnies, perhaps. So just more of trying to come to terms with the haunting. Let me see here. There's this little weird part here. It could just be a joke, but it says here, sacrificing me for a cup of coffee, do not be surprised, and I say it darkly, do not be surprised if you lose your Luke in this cause. Perhaps Mrs. Dudley has not yet had her own mid-morning snack, and she is perfectly capable of a filet de Luke, or perhaps there's a French word there, depending upon her mood, if I do not return. So he's basically saying that he's afraid that this creepy landlord cook lady, this maintenance lady, is going to cook him and eat him. So that's a little strange. I'm not sure where Shirley Jackson's actually going with that. Charles says, let's go up to 8 likes. Yeah, we got 8 souls in here, so let's see 8 likes. I would appreciate it. I know you guys can do it. Okay, so here's when Stephen King, Stanley Kubrickian sort of elements come into this. Now, this was written way before Stephen King or the Stanley Kubrick movies. But basically, they're sleeping one night or one afternoon, And all of a sudden, blood shows up on Theodore's door. You guys hear those people carrying on upstairs? And it's not all over. So basically, Theodore is really creeped out because there's blood all over the door. So obviously, things are starting to come to a head here. She says she's hysterical. Something has gotten red paint in her room and she's crying over her clothes. I would swear that it was blood, and yet so much blood one would almost have to. And then she went quiet. The smell was atrocious, and the writing on the wall had dripped and splattered. There was a line of drops from the wall to the wardrobe, perhaps what had first turned Theodore's attention that way, and a great irregular stain on the green rug. It's disgusting, Eleanor said. Please get Theo in my room. Okay, so, that's just pretty horrifying, right? I think, and I'm not, because it's simply too horrible to be real. So all of a sudden there's blood showing up on people's doors. Now there is another esoteric reference here that we will maybe get into. It's just a real quick thing, but it says, among the Sufis there is a teaching that the universe has never been created and consequently cannot be destroyed. I have spent the afternoon browsing in our little library. So I'm just going to look this up real quick so we can extrapolate some meaning from that. So the Sufis, or the Sufis, is based on an ideology by Idries Shah. The Sufis is one of the best known books on Sufism. So Sufism is sort of some type of occult ideology by the writer Idries Shah. First published in 1964 with an introduction by Robert Graves. The Sufi is an individual who believes that by practicing alternative detachment and identification with life, he becomes free. He is a mystic because he believes astonishing impact of Sufism on the Western development. I'm trying to figure out where the rest of that paragraph was. But some kind of weird cult. I'm not an expert in Sufism. If you have any people that are well versed in Sufism, my brother says paying attention to animal encounters could be a great way to see omens. Doves, crows, foxes, and dragonflies, etc. So, yeah, that's really interesting, too. Thanks for mentioning that. So, not really sure. Is it sort of some type of Indian philosophy or something? So anyway, but there is a reference to that. It looks like maybe Eastern or maybe from Afghanistan or something. But it's some type of like, how do I say, I'm trying to think of the word. Oh, here's a Wikipedia. The Sufis is one of the best. So there's a book called Sufis, but there's also a philosophy called Sufis. So I'm not really sure which came first, but they're considered Orientalists, right? Let's see what their faith is here. What it actually is. I don't know. This is kind of, so like I said, you have to kind of work to find these things. I'm not really sure what Sufism is, but it's some type of, religious or maybe like religious cult or something. Acceptable to non-specialists at a time when the study of Sufism had largely become the reserve of Orientalists. I'm not really sure why that was referenced in here, but it is an interesting rabbit hole to go down. Sufism. I did previously find a better definition for it, but it's escaping me at the moment. Okay, so on page 6, we're going way over our time here. We'll probably wrap this up in the next 10 minutes so we can move on to the Howling. Unless you guys think this is interesting, and we'll just take our time, but I don't think the Hill House needs too much explaining, but there is a couple more things we need to hit. So basically on page 120, Eleanor starts to be haunted by the ghost of a dog, right? Or the ghost of a child, I mean. And also, it's not just the ghost of a child, but I think in this particular passage, we basically come to understand what Eleanor is suffering from. It says right here, now Eleanor thought, perceiving that she was lying sideways on the bed in the black darkness, holding with both hands to Theodore's hand. Holding so tight she could feel the fine bones of Theodore's fingers. Now I will not endure this. They think to scare me. So basically she's hearing all this background of some entity fighting with a child or something like that. And it goes on to say, I am scared, but more than that, I am a person, I am human. I am walking, reasoning, humorous human being, and I will take a lot from this lunatic, filthy house, but I will not go along with hurting a child. I will not. I will, by God, get my mouth to open right now, and I will yell, stop it, she shouted, and the lights were on the way she left him, and Theodore was sitting up in bed, startled and disheveled. So I think it's an allusion to a potential sexual abuse of Eleanor when she was a child, and she's kind of reliving it now. Or maybe it's a manifestation, like we talked about with the needle on a phonograph, of previous events manifesting themselves in the psyches or the psychological the psychological fears of these characters. And it turns out that when she references holding Theodora's hand, Theodora is across the room, sitting up in bed, and she was also being belabored by some type of force, and she was not holding Theodora's hand. So whose hand was she holding? She was holding some type of, hand of an entity, which is really creepy. And there's some references here to Eleanor talks about how she never had a mother, and stuff like that, which is, what she probably means by that is she had a mother, but her mother was sick, or either that or a bad mother. But I do think there's some, abuse sort of stuff going on there with Eleanor. Very mysterious protagonist, one of the most mysterious protagonists and sort of sad characters I've ever read about. So really when the occult sort of starts to get involved in this book really happens here. And let me just go to the beginning of this chapter here. The UK is full of banshees and folklore. The Gaelic. So I'm trying to figure out where we're going with this. Let's see here. So basically they start getting trapped in these different nether worlds. And they wander out of Hill House into this nether world, and there's voices talking to them, saying various things. And Dr. Montague and Luke basically said, where have you all been? We've been looking for you for hours, right? Now, here's when things take a turn for the occult. Dr. Montague's wife basically comes to the house to kind of see what's been going on. And she's heavily involved in the cult. And she says, I said I'd be here today, didn't I? Did you ever know me not to come when I said I would? Well, somebody had to drive, Mrs. Montague said. She says here, these are my friends who have been staying in Hill House. I think Luke is introducing Dr. Montague's wife to these individuals. You've been here nearly a week, and I suppose you've done nothing with planchette. Automatic writing, ? I don't imagine either of these young women had mediumistic gifts. So I'm going to tell you guys what a planchette is. Most of you guys probably already know this. Planchette. I'm sure you guys recognize this particular device here. Now, what does this remind you of? I'm sure you guys have seen it. This is an early form of the Ouija board, right? We recognize that shape. And this was maybe an earlier duration of it when they would maybe post esoteric things on this piece of wood. Almost looks like a guitar pick or something. And they would maybe read from it and maybe move it. And then eventually it developed into the full-fledged Ouija board. So Dr. Montague and Mrs. Montague are playing around with Ouija boards and planchette and trying to contact spirits, right? The book plot reminds me of Conjuring or Insidious. Yeah, definitely. Not so much in that vein of like jump scares, but something around. Now, basically, Dr. Montague's wife is trying to find out who is willing to delve further into the occult, so to speak. There have been decided manifestations. There's a definite cold spot just outside the nursery door. So there's something going on in the nursery, or something that took place in the nursery. But we have a policy against going out after dark. So, and this is where the book really takes a turn. We're kind of getting towards the end of it here. The spirits dwelling in this house may be actually suffering because they are aware that you are afraid of them. So you have this element of like not giving in to your fears. And then there's a reference to maybe her suitcase is full of ectoplasm. Do you guys remember the whole, like at the turn of the century, sort of coming out of the tail end of the Victorian age, there was this photographic propaganda that was sort of what is known as ectoplasm, and it was probably some type of psyop, but ectoplasm was sort of like maybe a potential manifestation of spirits. We could maybe look that up here. Victorian ectoplasm ghosts. Ectoplasm producing mediums. So, like, just this really weird kind of stuff like this or whatever. I'm not, yeah, and I was obvious, I'm not sure how seriously it was taken. Helen Duncan was well known for using dolls and other props as ectoplasm in her seances. I mean, this is some weird ass shit. What's up, Mary? I agree. Will not even allow them to be on my home. Ectoplasm was like gloop. Yes, but what was it exactly? What does it represent? It definitely looks like some weird esoteric kind of stuff, you know? Very weird shit. Was it just staged to like make things look creepy? Or was it a way of contacting a medium or something? Or mediums contacting the dead or something? Let's read a little bit up on that. Ectoplasm is a term used in spiritualism to denote a substance or spiritual energy exteriorized by physical mediums. It was coined in 1894 by psychological researcher Charles Richet. Although the term is widespread in popular culture, there is no scientific evidence that ectoplasm exists, and many proposed examples were exposed. So yeah, it's definitely some type of hoax. It's sort of maybe trying to allude to the fact that these people were contacting spirits during seances. It definitely doesn't look very convincing, but it's kind of creepy. Like the folklore that went on during the Victorian age is definitely like something worth unpacking. Very interesting type stuff. I think that picture is fake. Yes, it probably is. So we just have a reference to that. And then they start playing around with planchette or the Ouija board. I think perhaps after dinner we will have a little session with planchette. Just Arthur and I, of course. The rest of you I can see are not ready. You would only drive away the spirits. So planchette, and then the planchette starts to talk to Mrs. Montague in the voice of a nun. So we have this juxtaposition of, you know, not only sexual tension between Eleanor and maybe Theodora and repressed childhood trauma and esotericism of the occult and ghosts and hauntings, but we also have this element of maybe a Christian worldview sort of attempting to battle the occult or something. Because there's an old ghost that lives at Hill House that was previously a nun. He went on, this is a device similar to the Ouija board, or perhaps I might explain better by saying that this is a form of automatic writing. So it's actually not a Ouija board. A Ouija board maybe is a little bit different, but this is a form of automatic writing, a method of communicating with intangible beings. Although to my way of thinking, the only intangible beings who ever get in touch through one of these things are the imaginations of the people running it. So there's a little bit of skepticism going on there too. Some of these characters don't quite believe it. Planchette is a little piece of light wood, usually heart-shaped or triangular. A pencil is set into the narrow end, and at the other end is a pair of wheels or feet which will slip easily over paper. Two people place fingers on it, ask it questions, and the object moves, pushed by what force we will not here discuss, and writes answers. The Ouija board, as I say, is very similar, except that the objects move on a board pointing to separate letters. An ordinary wine glass will do the same thing. I have seen it tried with a child's wheeled toy, although I will admit that it looks silly. Each person using the tips for the fingers of one hand, keeping the other's hand free to note. And we see Ouija boards all across Hollywood, you know, Beetlejuice, you know, Hereditary, you know, all kinds of places. So, but there is a little bit of a difference between a Ouija board and the planchette. The planchette is mostly just the automatic writing. I'm not sure exactly how it automatically writes. That's a little bit unclear. Planchette felt very strongly about a nun. Perhaps something of the sort. A dark, vague figure even has been seen in the neighborhood. Villagers terrified with staggering home at night. The figure of a nun is fairly common. I assume you are suggesting that I am mistaken, or perhaps it is your intention to point out that our planchette may be mistaken. I assure you, and you must believe planchette, even if my word is not good enough for you, that a nun was most specifically suggested. I'm only trying to say, my dear, that the wrath of a nun is far and away the most common form of appearance. So there's a little bit of skepticism there, but, and that could be like a red herring. Maybe the spirits are throwing them a distraction of sorts, right? Fake, but still creepy, definitely. Thank you. Shout out to the 8 people in the chat. I really appreciate you spending your pre-Halloween week with me this evening. We're going to fast forward here. So basically, in a nutshell, Eleanor is driven out not only by the hauntings themselves, but by her sort of fragility. She's emotionally and mentally fragile, and Dr. Montague and Mrs. Montague kind of want her out of the picture. Like they're not trying to kill her, but they want her out of the house because they're worried something is going to happen. Now I'm going to probably skip over some of this here, but there's a weird reference to something about shepherds dancing in the Easter egg, and Easter eggs covered in sugar, or Easter eggs in sugar. So a little bit of Christian, maybe esoteric mythology there. Or maybe it's some type of inversion is probably what it's more akin to. Now, this will definitely take a rereading. And I talked a little bit about the relationship between Theodore and Eleanor. And it's all sort of sparsely, very subtly thrown in here. So it's hard to extrapolate where she was actually going with that. But do you guys want to hear the ending, or do you want me to just skip the ending and we can move on to the Howling? And I actually wrote here, not a great ending, but interesting. The story seems disjointed and confusing, needs to be read over. Basically, when Theodore leaves, something happens. I'm just going to leave it at that. That way you guys will be encouraged to read it. We knocked it out in an hour. I was hoping to get it done quicker, but it's just not possible. So a lot of themes there. Like I said, you could talk for hours about the haunting of Hill House. Automatic writing is a divination tool. The person wanting to do it channels a spirit. Maybe the planchette is a conductor. Yeah. No ending, please. Okay, yeah. I gave plenty of spoilers, but hopefully enough to, interest you. We're going to move on to the Howling here. So the Howling, very similar to the Entity in some ways. And we talked about, I told you guys in the beginning that these novels are centered around sexual tension, sexual assault, repressed sexuality. And the Howling is interesting because it actually starts with a sexual assault. It starts with a woman being belabored by this man. It's not like the first chapter, but it's maybe the second or the third. And basically, the universe of the Howling is basically this. In the dark Arda forest on the border between Greece and Bulgaria, there is a dead gray patch of land roughly 1 mile square where no one goes and nothing lives. It was called Draja. Even when the village lived, it was a place of darkness. Peasants from the surrounding lands made the sign of the cross when they spoke its name. There was evil in the village. The evil took various forms depending on the storyteller. In the bleak autumn of 1583, all this changed. So he's doing like a flashback here. Basically, this ancient village, or not ancient, but, post-Renaissance. And this place was, on the border of Greece and Bulgaria. So that's a really creepy place just on its own. But it was inhabited by gypsies. Gypsies often made their camp. To one of the gypsies, he gave a message for her brothers in the home village, telling of the tragedies that had befallen. So this is sort of like the old world werewolf, and then we sort of move into the modern world on chapter 1. And it takes place in Los Angeles, and then these characters, Karen Beatty and her husband Roy, are basically having a lot of marital problems, right? It talks about their sort of, I'm not sure how recently they've been married, but there's some sexual tension there. Roy is really busy at work. He doesn't have a lot of time to, lay with his wife or whatever. But on top of that, and this is kind of how we'll kind of get into the story here. He's basically like, he edits manuscripts or something like that, and he has to travel in order to do that. Let's see here. So basically, already on chapter 11, this man comes while her husband, Karen's husband, is basically out of town. Now, some of you guys, I should mention this, some of you guys have probably seen the movie from the 80s, The Howling, which is a really great movie, and we're going to actually show one clip from it because it's really creepy. But the movie, The Howling, is really nothing like the book. I definitely encourage you to read the book, The Howling, because this is where you kind of get into more of the sort of the occult mythology behind werewolves. It's sort of referenced a little bit in the movie, but not quite as well as the book. So basically, on page 11, this supposed maintenance man comes up and basically assaults her. I'm not going to read it. And I think what's interesting about the Howling, as well as the entity that we talked about, is that they're male writers. So just by default, there is an element of sort of maybe sexual eroticism by the way that they write about their female characters. And I'm not saying that to denigrate the writing, because they're great writers, but it just makes you wonder, if these novels were written by a woman, what would they sound like? What would they sort of entail? So there is the element of not only the occult and werewolves and hauntings, but there's the element of sexual eroticism, sometimes, unfortunately, under the duress of, women being assaulted and stuff like that. So I think that was just important to sort of point out. So basically, this woman gets assaulted, and that's sort of where that's how they end up in this village. Basically, her husband comes home, and they, she tells her husband, Karen tells her husband Roy what took place, and he basically says that, let's take a break from the city life. Let's get out of Los Angeles and move to, basically they're moving out into a cabin in the woods. And I wrote it here. Karen and Roy moved to Drago. It's basically like in the outskirts in the woods of California. So that's kind of what's taking place in the novel now. Been years since I watched the movie, and I enjoy books. I can study the details. Yeah, definitely. I'd encourage you guys to read it. So we'll try to knock out The Howling pretty quickly here, maybe by 8:20, 8:30. So the sex, like I said, is really lousy between Roy and Karen. But all of a sudden, while they're making love at night or not making love, they're kind of just sitting around. Their relationship is kind of starting to crumble, right? But Karen starts to hear the howling. It's a play on the title, but she starts to hear werewolves, and people are telling her that it's just coyotes, don't worry, that sort of thing. She says, the mournful, sinister cry, the howling, she knew it would come as surely as death. They're making love, and then Roy basically rolls over and falls asleep. He's a lousy fuck, right? So they have no radio, or let's see here. They have no television, so they're kind of rediscovering the radio, just passing the time. At night, Karen tried to let go during sex, but it became harder all the time to pretend she was enjoying it. Roy's lovemaking became perfunctory, and at last he merely kissed her goodnight and turned away. Then while he slept, Karen would lie on her back, her muscles tight, and stare into the dark. Every now and again, the howling came. Karen no longer asked Roy if he heard it, because Roy either hears it or he's just pretending like he doesn't hear it. So basically, in this village of Drago, I think it's called, right? Yeah, the village of Drago, everybody seems kind of normal, but there's no pets in the town, right? So that's a little weird. Hey, Fiona, thank you for joining the chat. Really appreciate you guys. Shout out to all the live people in the chat. So there's no pets here, which is awfully strange, and everybody's kind of weird. Everybody in the in the town of Drago keeps to themselves, right? Let's see here. I'm sorry. She was basically Karen's basically talking to herself in her head to her husband Roy. I'm sorry, dear. I was all ready and in the mood to have sex, and then something howled outside. No, it was not an owl. And after that, the only picture in my mind was that filthy animal with his hands up in me and his teeth biting me. And then, so she's having nightmares of this creature basically belaboring her, but it's also a manifestation of the rape scene that we saw earlier in the text. In the beginning of the book, we had this pretty shocking rape scene. So let's see here. So that's one way to sort of analyze the repressed sexuality. Like the sex with her husband is not going anywhere. He's kind of, he's trying his best, but he's kind of aloof. And he doesn't really know how to sort of fix the trauma that his wife is dealing with. And it's not only destroying her, but it's destroying their marriage as well. So basically they have a dog too, and I think you guys will know what's going to happen here. But their dog turns up missing, and Roy Beatty kind of just downplays it and said, oh, it's probably just a coyote or whatever. So a little bit of denial, right, of what's really taking place. So basically he says here, I've run into some problems that cannot be solved without going to meet with the writer. So he's basically editing manuscript, and Catherine is having to stay out in Drago in this log cabin by herself. And basically she rides down the road and comes upon a library, and there's a woman there named Oreo Jolivet, and I think she's the librarian, I want to say. And she basically takes out all these books about werewolves because Karen is convinced that it's a werewolf. And because of that, there's also a conversation that takes place here between one of the, I think it's the same lady, the librarian. Why aren't there any pets in Drago? The sheriff said the people here didn't keep many animals, but I haven't seen a single dog or cat on the street. So, that kind of all speaks for itself. And she's reading occult werewolf books. And then I think in the next chapter, the librarian shows up. So maybe previously she was going to the library. It doesn't really matter. So also similar to Haunting of Hill House, one of the characters in this book named Inez Polk was formerly a nun, but now she's more into the occult. She studies demonology and stuff like that. Definitely sort of the juxtaposition of a former, maybe a nun, or any of these characters in these books. Like we have this tension between their former faith, their former religious practices versus the occult is constantly tempting these characters to sort of, drag them down into darkness. So let's see here. There's something worth mentioning. She's talking to Karen here. Karen, that a belief in God requires a counter belief in Satan. You must know your enemy before you can defeat him. No, not the devil himself, she says, but that Drago has a werewolf. So, and Karen doesn't really believe, or I think Karen is telling this woman, Inez, that Drago has a werewolf. But we hear that the woman is basically telling Karen that a belief in God requires a counter belief in Satan. You must know your enemy before you can defeat him. So she's basically telling Karen that, yes, there is a werewolf, but she's not really saying it. She's letting Karen sort of ask the question. So we have this juxtaposition of religion, esotericism, werewolves, good versus evil, right? That's all pretty plain as day. Let's see here where we're at. No, the werewolf is a servant of the devil. No one becomes a werewolf by chance. It's like witchcraft. In return, you pledge your everlasting soul. In the Middle Ages, life could be an ugly, painful existence if you were very poor and the price of your soul did not seem too much to pay for the powers of the werewolf. But today, surely, there can't be people still making deals with the devil. So basically what Gary Bradner is doing here, he's putting, this is definitely much darker than like Lon Chaney the Wolfman, or maybe even American Werewolf in London. It's basically, by default, linking werewolf lycanthropy with the occult and with the devil, essentially. And it also not only does that as in terms of like esoteric occult propaganda, but it puts it in like a medieval mindset. It really helps you get into the mindset of what, these different mental disorders and different, supernatural occult creatures that people thought they were being belabored by back then. So then, basically what happens here is Karen finds remains. I'm not going to tell you what the remains are because I want you guys to read the book. But something's lurking out in the woods, and she finds the remains of something and someone that was dear to her. It's not her husband. Her husband is still alive. And on page 87 here, we have the first werewolf attack. Werewolves are ancient legends explained what we would now call serial killers, thinking about middle-aged serial killers. Yeah, definitely. Like, that was a thing, too. Like, they would deem serial killers or rapists like, werewolves or vampires and stuff like that. All great horror stories start with a cabin. Let me see here. Somebody texted. My brother's texting me here. Yeah, my brother said, yeah, I still got the Shirley Jackson picture up here. Let's put a different one here. Let's put the Howling. A couple different images here. I kind of like this one here. This one's cool. I can find it. I'll just kind of leave that like that. Does that look all right for you guys? This is a scene from the Howling. Not sure if it's the Howling 1 or Howling 2 or Howling 3, but that is a scene from the Howling. Thanks for the reminder. Page 87, we have the first werewolf attack here. Is that better? Elizabeth Bathory and Vlad the Impaler. Yeah, definitely. All that stuff. This stuff doesn't come out of a vacuum. It's been around forever. So we have a first werewolf attack. I forgot who gets attacked here. It's some other peripheral characters. It's not the main characters. And then these two hikers come to visit the house in Drago, and then they end up disappearing. Something happens to them. So I'm going to skip over some of these werewolf scenes because the werewolf basically starts to attack everybody in Drago. But what's interesting is that it's almost like a secret society, because who are the people? Who are the werewolves, guys? Who are the werewolves? If somebody wants to put into the chat, it's not the main protagonist yet, but the werewolves are, I'm sure you guys already know. The werewolves are basically all the people in Drago. A little spoiler there, but it is important because it sort of alludes to the idea of a secret werewolf society. And then we have these scenes of Roy slowly gets seduced by this woman, and he can't quite figure why he's so drawn to her, and he starts cheating on his wife. And the manifestation of that is he refers to this woman's allure, this woman's sexuality as very primal, very animal-like. So I think we can see where we're going with that. It says here, he was deep in a dream of the dark woods and the savage love of a green-eyed woman. Just brilliantly done there. We also have some different weird references to, like, I believe there was a werewolf in Drago. I believe the werewolf killed, I'm going to keep that out just so I don't spoil it, and also killed the two kids who came hiking through the other day and killed God knows how many others. I believe the werewolf is Anton Godek. So basically there's like this hysteria taking place with Karen and her husband Roy. And there's like this mass hysteria of who is the werewolf, right? We're getting towards the tail end here, so we can kind of move on to the Howling, but I don't want to rush the end of this because it is important. Yo, what's up, Tones? How you doing? Popped in to smash the like button. Yeah, I hope you'll stick around for a little bit. We're talking about the Howling here. Should be really interesting. So now on page 131, shout out to everybody in the chat. Thank you for sharing links and all your interesting information. We have some really sexual explicit scenes here that I'm not going to read on camera. But this book is very heavily sexually driven, right? It's a good read. And I'd say it's fairly tasteful. Gary Bradner is a really good writer, but it is very erotic, right? And we see that a lot in horror books, in horror movies. We see this element of the erotic. And I think sometimes that's just a manifestation of male writers, perhaps Hollywood writers. But what's interesting about The Howling as well as The Entity is that these books were written in the 80s. The Howling was published in, I want to say, this was actually published in the 70s. And I think The Entity might have actually been 1978. So these are actually a little before the 80s, but it's coming out of sort of the tail end or the mid end of the quote unquote sexual revolution, right? But how does the sexual revolution and things like pornography and Playboy and stuff, how do those things manifest themselves in horror or in male writers? I think it kind of comes out in these, not only the males repressed sexuality, these writers are writing about women being belabored by werewolves and ghosts. And so there's a lot of really dark occult stuff there, but they're also dealing with their own sexuality in terms of how they can manifest their masculinity. And oftentimes it comes in these sort of, very graphic, like sexual assault, fantasies perhaps that these male writers might be exploring, but they're also creating really strong female protagonists that overcome these, sexual exploits and whatnot. And these women are sort of like the ones that they're the masters of their own destiny, apart from like the people that belabor them. The women are these male writers, even though they default into like, eroticism sometimes. They explain really well, or they help you get into the mindset of these women that are suffering from sexual problems, marital tensions and sexual assault and stuff like that. So it is interesting how these male writers do that, but I think they are responding to what it was like to grow up during that sexual revolution, where they could walk downtown to the red light district or whatever, or their local supermarket, and buy, explicit magazines and stuff like that. I think that's something to keep in mind, is how does, I don't want to say sexual exploitation per se, but sexual deviance or sexual repressed sexuality, how does that manifest itself in horror? A werewolf is a very masculine figure, right? So we can kind of see why Gary Bradner might have used that. And by the time we get to The Howling, we'll talk a little bit more about that. You're going to read The Howling? That's so awesome. I'm excited. Yeah, we're going to get towards the tail end of this. And all this stuff is kind of relevant to The Entity as well as Hill House. But basically I wrote here, this werewolf character, or this woman, Marcia, basically controls Roy's sexuality. And it's the opposition to a rape, from the rape scene in the beginning, because basically it says here, after Roy had sex with this green-eyed woman, he felt drained. He felt empty. Across the room, Marcia lit a candle, and the first time he realized the night had come. She walked around gathering up his clothes and brought them to him. So basically he's being belabored in another way by this woman. And you guys can read the book to find out what exactly she is. He recited the Greek alphabet aloud, forward first, then backwards. Omega, I don't know how to read Greek very well, but and then he just follows suit, reading the Greek alphabet backwards, trying to rehabilitate himself. So I think that's a little esoteric thing Gary Bradner thrown in there, reading the Greek alphabet backwards perhaps. Slash horror, sex and death, writers like Kuntz wrote a lot of these novels, and it was prevalent. Yeah, definitely. It was prevalent. These hypersexualized 80s occult, late 70s horror movies were very, very juxtaposed by erotic literature and sort of the height of Penthouse and Playboy and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's important to kind of keep in your peripheral as far as what these writers were responding to. I think they knew who their readers were, in maybe most cases, maybe male readers, but they also had some female readers as well, but they're kind of catering to that low-level adolescent, repressed sexuality perhaps. So I just wrote a couple themes here: sexual tension, infidelity, conspiracy, paranoia, lust, and betrayal. Getting towards the tail end here. So basically, I don't want to spoil this too much. So let me see how I can do that. We have some also some other lesbian Skittles type stuff in there. But basically, in a nutshell, we can close out the Howling here pretty easily. The Howling is not only about the individual sexual trauma and sexual awakening or lack of awakening of these individual characters, but it's also about perhaps a society, and it's not necessarily a realistic scenario, right? But it could, you could branch off this idea into other levels of maybe the elite or maybe just rural areas out in Europe or God knows where, of a secret society that's kind of aware of a problem in their society, but they're not actually addressing it, or the ones that are perpetrating these problems in any society are the ones that are creating it. So they're keeping things, and it sort of dovetails into the idea of a secret society is basically is what I'm saying. And basically all of the characters within reason become werewolves. So that's pretty much the Howling. But before we move on to the entity, I do want to show you the transformation scene from the Howling, because it's actually pretty darn disturbing. Now, somebody said in the comments section on this video, why is she just standing there, right? But that's part of sort of the, you got to suspend disbelief. But it is quite terrifying, I think. Should do a stream and watch the Ghost Report. Yeah, we might do that at some point. But basically, his ribs are breaking. And it really shows you, like, how painful it might be to become a werewolf, you know? But you also have the element of, like, they're trying to sort of cast an erotic tone to it. You know, she's like, it's almost like, not like she's having sex, but it is sort of a metaphor for, like, repressed sexuality, right? And this, I forgot who this character was, but... And like I said, the book is nothing like the movie, really. So they're two separate entities, but... I mean, look at that. That's fucking disturbing, dude. He's like rising up in the air. I think I rented it. Look at this. Like his mouth starts going like... Fucking creepy, dude. Literally covering the screen. I mean, it's kind of campy in some ways, but it's still terrifying to me. I think I've been on a date with a guy like that. Reminds me of Beetlejuice. Yeah, definitely. It just goes on and on and on until he's like propped up on the counter and he's like a full-fledged wolf. Beetlejuice is a comedy and a horror. That's actually an interesting question because me and Charles and Marissa have been trying to debate that forever. The last couple of weeks, we're kind of debating that. So let me pull up a good little image of the entity here for you guys. I'm going to pull up a picture of the of the original cover of the book. If I can find a good one here. This one's all right if we can get it. This is a better one here. So this is Frank De Felitta. See if we can get a better image here. Just want to see how this looks on screen. That should look pretty decent, but this is the author right here. And we're going to get into the entity here now. We're going to start talking about the entity. Obviously, I have the new pressing of it. And I really like the new artwork too, but you can definitely see that he's going with sort of the erotic theme with the original cover. And one of my friends on YouTube actually has the original version. So this is going to be a tough one. It's going to be a long one, maybe not too long. We'll see how quick we can get through it. I don't think it's going to take forever, but there's a lot of things we have to cover in the entity. Now, I'll basically start by saying that we'll get into some of this stuff, but the entity, similar to the Howling, is, you know, you can apply some of those themes of sexuality and stuff like that, eroticism, but it's also this big sort of paranormal psyop that was started, that came out of UCLA University. By two parapsychologists named Carrie Gaynor and Barry Taft. And then somewhere along the line, Frank De Felitta claims that he was involved in the investigations. I don't know if he actually was or how serious these investigations were. But parapsychology was kind of sort of new at the time, not brand new, but basically these individuals at UCLA were trying to get funding to sort of explore the world of parapsychology, right? And if you actually look pretty deeply into this story, there's really no evidence to suggest that any of this ever took place. Now, the book is marketed as this sort of true story, right? This true story, based on a true story type deal. And there are some photographs that we might talk about, that we could get into from the entity. I'll show you a couple. I'll show you the little video clip from the Ghost Report from Carrie Gaynor. But to my knowledge, from all the research that I've done, most of this was fabricated. Now, it could be partially true, or, you know, maybe there was some type of haunted house investigation going on, and maybe it kind of started like that, but by the time the whole story was out there, it was completely, you know, embellished and fabricated, right? But this was probably the best horror book maybe that I've ever read, and definitely out of the two. You know, The Howling is kind of, you know, I don't want to say like, it's more in the vein of Stephen King. You know, there's a lot of cheap thrills and sex scenes and stuff. And Haunting of Hill House was difficult just for how esoteric it was. You know, it's very esoteric. So I got some work to do on that in terms of getting that a little more under my belt. But the entity, I think on the surface level, is a little easier to follow. But not only that, the way that Frank De Felitta writes this is like, it's definitely a page turner. I took my time with it. I spent about a month and a half, maybe 2 months on it. But you could definitely really get through this, but it's actually really dense too. Now, just a little bit about Frank De Felitta. He comes from a military background, a little bit of a military-industrial connection there. He's definitely involved in the occult. He wrote a book called Audrey Rose and wrote some other stuff. But basically, this is a complicated plot, and I'm not going to do a full rundown, but the main character is named Carlotta Moran, and she's based on Doris Bither. I could maybe show you guys a picture. And there's only one picture of Doris Bither that I was able to find. But the main protagonist is this lady right here. And what's creepy about this photo, if I can get this a little bigger, a bunch of junk, and those are some nude scenes from the movie, which is not what I was trying to get here. Let's see if we can get this one a little bigger. And yes, there is a movie with Barbara Hershey that's really, really good. You guys can't really see this. I'll see if I can find a bigger picture of this because I do want to show it. Is this the one we just clicked on? I read The Haunting of Anne Audrey Rose. It's scary. Don't read it at night. Yeah, so this is a great picture here. It's a little bit cropped, but this is allegedly Doris Bither right here in the middle of the bed. And there's something just very eerie about this entire photo here, whether it was staged or whether it was not. But obviously you see that arc of light that does not get bent at the corner of the wall. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But this is allegedly Doris Bither, and Frank De Felitta recreates this character named Carlotta Moran that is pretty much a really good manifestation of this lady. So obviously there were some pictures taken at this paranormal investigation, so there was obviously something going on. Maybe most of it was staged, but this arc of light that you see here is allegedly the entity that was stalking her. But there's also speculation that it was a piece of hair on the lens. I don't really believe it, but I read an article kind of debunking some of these photos from Carrie Gaynor and Barry Taft. But basically the book starts with the intro, and her boyfriend at the time, his name is Jorge Jerry Rodriguez, is booked on first-degree assault charge in the presence of Officer John Flynn. So basically, her ex-boy, we'll get to the ending in a little bit, but basically the book starts at the beginning and then goes back to the beginning. And the reason why he's in jail, her boyfriend is in jail, is because he was basically trying to protect her from the entity, but it didn't look like that, right? Because nobody else saw the entity. And he was like, he had a chair, and the entity was trying to accost his girlfriend, and he took the chair and started smashing the entity, but he ended up smashing her in the face or whatever, right? So the book kind of starts immediately with this. You don't really know until you get to the end of the book what's actually taking place. I'm not going to give too many more spoilers than that. I'll try not to, but that's just kind of puts it in context. The book starts with Carlotta Moran, and she's kind of definitely this woman that's struggling. She's struggling to make ends meet. She's raising 4 kids by herself, but she does have this off and on. She is in relationships, but most of the time she's kind of on her own. So let's start with some of her memories of the entity. And it's beautiful writing here, but it says this was what she remembered thinking before it happened. Some knock, like being hit by a charging fullback, plummeted her across the room and onto the bed. In a blank mind, she realized that the pillows were suddenly around her head. Then they were smashed down over her face. In the darkness, Carlotta thought she was going to die. Carlotta was sinking into helpless death, but she felt huge hands on her knees, her legs, and inside of her legs, which were being pried apart, pulled open, far apart, and then some knowledge floated like a shot up through her consciousness, and she understood, and it filled her with energy. There was somebody else in the room, she says. Again, we see Carlotta sank into darkness. She had seen nothing. So that, I don't have to explain too much more with what's taking place there. I think you guys can kind of get where this is going. But she's living on her own, a single mother living with 4 kids. She's studying to be a secretary, which is not going to bring her a lot of money, but she has to travel all the way across town several times a week to get to class. So she's living a very stress-induced situation. And she's being belabored, in the words of Frank De Felitta, being belabored by this entity. She says here, Carla had no doubt knew she had been assaulted by this entity. It was a little like having a death in the family, Carlotta thought. You knew it would get better. Everything would return to normal. You would forget it all, but in the meantime, you have to live through that feeling of being alone in a dark pit. And it says here, Carlotta was a realist. Her outlook was grounded by necessity and by her own experience. There were few or no illusions she had about herself or where she was going. But it's just little things like this. Let's see here. Just the way that Frank De Felitta is able to get you into the psychology or the worldview of this woman is just really brilliant. I would say it definitely surpasses the Howling on that level. It says the house was stuffy and claustrophobic. Now, going back a little bit to the actual real case, some people tried to reach out to Doris Bither's children, and they maybe gave some statements and very small, obscure articles. I mean, we could do a whole nother rabbit hole later on down the road about further investigations of what is known as the entity case. To my knowledge, it was sort of a university paranormal occult psyop, but it could have been based on some actual events or alleged events, but it's just so hard to contact these people. Eventually, this Doris Bither character, basically faded into the shadows. Nobody knows what happened to her. But whether or not it's real, it does make for a really, really good story. And maybe if I show you this video here, it will kind of put this book a little bit into context. We'll kind of show the video, and maybe then we'll go back to the text, or should we do it in reverse? Let me know in the chat. Do you guys want me to keep talking about the book, or do you want me to show you the little clip that might give you a little bit more of a background, and then we can start talking about some of the interesting things? It might be easier to see the video, and then we can talk about how the book differs from maybe the movie by with Barbara Hershey. Did you say she was assaulted? Yes, this woman's being belabored and assaulted by this creature, this entity, and it manifests itself in a number of ways. But I think what Felita is getting at is, again, sexual trauma. Video first. Okay, my brother wants to watch the video. Do we have one more vote to point me in the right direction? Because the video, it won't really spoil the book. So I think we could watch the video. I'm just waiting for the video to catch up. I just want to make sure. Video. Okay, we got 2 votes for the video. If you want me to turn it up a little bit, just let me know. It should be pretty good.
In the quest for evidence, 2 researchers from UCLA, Carrie Gaynor and Dr. Barry Tam.
Now, I will warn you guys, this is pretty disturbing. This short little clip is about maybe less than 7 minutes, maybe 5 or 6 minutes. It's taken from an early 90s program called The Ghost Report, and Charles and I watched this when we were young, and it basically scarred us for life. We were like, really creeped out to go into houses, and it's just the way, and most of these stories are probably fake, right? But the way they present the information is just really disturbing.
Witness to the most celebrated case in ghost hunting history. Gaynor and Taft encountered an evil force inside one Los Angeles home, unlike anything anyone had ever experienced before. They called it simply the entity.
When I went over to her house, we conducted about a 2-hour interview, and during that time she told us a lot of interesting experiences, but I knew she was holding something back. And at the end of the interview, she finally admitted to us that she was attacked and raped by the ghost.
Okay, so this is Carrie Gaynor. This is, I think in the book, I forgot what his stand-in name is, but he's one of the guys from UCLA, allegedly, in the parapsychology department. Turn it up. I can't really turn it up too much louder, but
at that time, we thought
it's like full blast here.
Crazy.
Can you guys hear it at all?
The events that then transpired over the next 10 weeks were chronicled in the Journal of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics.
Because that's really, really loud on my end. It's going to like reverberate through the room. But maybe I can do it for a few minutes. Can you guys hear it, or can you guys not hear it?
Engineers. Including the night, the investigators went from being skeptics to true believers.
The lady screamed out, "It's in my bedroom." We ran in there. She shouted out, "It's over in the corner." We fired our Polaroid camera in the direction that she said. We didn't see anything, but the picture came out bleached out white completely. She shouted out again, "It's in the corner." Again, we fired our camera, and it was bleached out completely. At that point, I thought the camera was just...
Okay, so just a little background. They're taking photos trying to capture this entity, right? And they claim to have some proof. I don't know how serious or legitimate it is.
Functioning.
But that's what's taking
I waited
place.
until she said it was gone, and I took 2 control pictures. Those pictures are perfectly normal pictures. The only difference, she said it was in the corner in the first ones, and in these, she said it was gone. A few moments later, we felt a cold breeze of air coming through the door, accompanied by a horrible stench, a stench so foul some people were vomiting. We fired the camera in the direction that breeze was flowing towards us.
I love
The
that.
picture was
I love that the entity was accompanied by a stench so foul some people were vomiting. I mean,
bleached out completely, except at the bottom of the door where you can see a little round ball of light. A few minutes later, she screamed out, "It's right in front of my face." We fired the camera and the face was completely obliterated. As you can see the curtains behind her, you can see her dress. She shouted out again, "It's right in front of my face." Again, the face is completely obliterated. Now, those were her exact words, "It's right in front of my face." Once again, I wanted a control picture. I waited till she said it was gone, and I took the final picture. And this is a perfect, normal picture. It's just dark because we didn't adjust the setting. There's a scratch on it, which we put on it when we tried to clean it a little bit. But otherwise, it's a normal picture. The only difference between these two...
I know there's some trouble hearing it. We got some issues with OBS. I did test this out earlier, and it sounded pretty good to me. But just in case, if you guys want to go back and watch a little bit of this, I'll link it in the description after the stream is over, too.
One, she said it was in front of my face, and the other one, she said it was gone.
Even with these pictures, Gaynor still had trouble convincing his colleagues at UCLA that he was onto something significant.
Initially, they would say, "Well, you're hallucinating." So then I would look at them and say, "Well, we've got 20 witnesses." And they would say, "Well, then it's obviously mass hallucination."
Gaynor returned to the house several times, bringing more researchers with him each time, and the eerie phenomena became even more pronounced.
We started seeing balls of light lighting up the walls, and everybody in the room would see this. And the lights would get bigger and bigger and brighter and brighter. And at some point, I finally started talking to it. And I said, "Well, if you're really here, come off the wall." Because what I was concerned was that somebody in the room was faking it, and they were projecting the light onto the wall. Well, when I asked that question, the light lifted off the wall, floated into the middle of our room, started spinning and twisting and expanding in different directions simultaneously. It had full parallax. We could see it from all sides, and I had 9 professional photographers set up in the room that were shooting it from all sides. The lights came in. It was like, it almost come in like in a state of anger. It almost came, all right, here I am. This is me. And it came in, and it kind of did a little thing in the group, and then it was gone. It was the most extraordinary thing we've ever come across. It happened over and over again. We experienced a plethora of phenomena during that investigation. The part that interested me the most was the fact that what we saw, we were able to get on film.
The photographers at that session had only limited success capturing the entity on film, with one notable exception.
What we see here are reverse arcs of light. One arc goes right here, another arc goes right here. Now, the reason this picture is so important to us is that the arc on the wall, if it were really on the wall, would be bent, because those two walls there are perpendicular. It's not bent, which means the arc is floating in space. The significance of that for us as researchers is, of course, that means it's dimensional and very, very difficult to fake. This was not somebody with a flashlight shining it on a wall. That light is an empty space.
The negative of this photo was authenticated by Popular Photography and was the only alleged ghost photo ever published in the magazine.
Okay, so that's actually not completely true. The photograph was never, like, approved by, you know, a prestigious ghost magazine. It was featured or something. And then, according to the narrator here, Tim White, he said that this photograph, or this whole investigation, is detailed in a very large report done by the Institute of Technological something or another, but there's no evidence. I was never able to find where this document exists. So I think some of this stuff is definitely fabricated, but it definitely makes for a good story. And who are these actual people? There's actually some other photographs taken during the investigation where they're playing around with Ouija boards, and Carrie Gaynor and Barry Taft and some of the other, they brought a bunch of mediums into this house, right? And basically they're playing around with Ouija boards, trying to contact the spirits and stuff like that. So this is the author here, Frank DeFelitta. Maybe we'll watch a little bit of this, and then we'll kind of talk about the book a little bit.
The author of Audrey Rose was also witness to the phenomenon. His incredible first-hand experience in the Culver City, California house inspired him to write The Entity, which was later made into a motion picture.
all the instruments started clicking away. So I knew everyone was seeing this at the same time that I was. They were ducking, and everyone was saying, oh my God, look at that, oh my God. And then Doris started screaming. That was the woman who was being belabored by this creature. So I was screaming, I don't want to see your lights, show us yourself. Damn you, show us yourself. So I'm cursing and swearing at it. And there, lo and behold, at that point, it started to appear. It sort of developed a kind of arm was articulated. You could see sort of like an arm, and then a neck. And then of all things, a kind of bald head. Now, this could have been our imagination, but collectively, we saw the same thing, every one of us. We saw the same thing.
But we don't consider our pictures proof of anything. We consider them part of the struggle to gather evidence to try to understand this phenomenon. During our investigations, we spend thousands of hours trying to be in the right place at the right time. In the entity case, for some reason, we were there. We were there at the right time. And
So there's no evidence that Frank De Felitta was at these paranormal seances or anything like that. Maybe he was. From all the research that I've done, he was not really there. But so maybe they just kind of played that up for book sales or whatever, right? I was looking for a good thumbnail from the movie, but we'll just go back to this for now. But there is a really good movie with Barbara Hershey and a couple other good actors, but I think that documentary that we just showed, that's really the best place to start. And there's actually another documentary called The Entity Files, which is like a 50-minute documentary about it. Unsolved mysteries, sightings, histories, mysteries, ancient mysteries. We had so many good television programs back then. Now they all suck. She says here, the arm. She had felt the arm, the penis, only too real, urgent, but not really warm, but hard as could be. She felt the weight on her. There was no real sensation of something like a body on her, except for the hands and the penis. So if you watch the film with Barbara Hershey, you'll kind of get a better idea of what was taking place. And it's brilliantly written, because it's hard to describe, but the movie actually does a pretty decent job as well. So it says, slowly she drifted in a semi-consciousness, an awareness of half-formed images rising up out of the retinal chaos. Then she slept. So, and I wrote here, Carlotta possibly manifesting PTSD, and I think that's really what Frank De Felitta is getting at. Now, what that PTSD is, we'll talk a little bit about that, but I think it, in the case of Doris Bither, from what I've read about her, is that she had abusive boyfriends, but it also goes all the way back to her childhood, according to the book. That's a demon attack. Yeah, it's almost like a succubus, but it's something a little bit different, a little bit darker. Now the entity starts to move on to the children, and the family ends up leaving the house, and they stay at, it's 8:52. Thank you for sticking around, guys. I really appreciate it. We'll wrap up the entity here probably within the next half an hour. So the family leaves the house, and they're staying at various hotels, and they're staying at their neighbor's house as well. Just really beautiful anecdotes like this. Carlotta felt increasingly drained of energy with every passing second. Then tears began to form in her eyes, tears of exhaustion, frustration, and fear. She was crying but making no sound. Then she was through, too tired for tears or for thought. She fell asleep. They all slept without dreams. And he has these beautiful descriptions of Carlotta's feelings and just her anxieties, and that's what makes this book so powerful and makes it very readable, is that the subject matter is, pretty outlandish, but it's just so beautifully written. So let's see here. I was also have all right here. Just little things like this, and this pertains to Carlotta Moran's or Doris Bither's background. On the television screen, a well-dressed man in a business suit stood behind a lectern. He appeared that he was selling something with his white smile, and then he held up a huge Bible and thrust it into the camera. It seemed to Carlotta that he had thrust it into her. So basically, we're dealing with a woman that has not only relationship baggage, but going all the way back to her childhood, she grew up in a religious cult. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get towards the tail end. but there's obviously, I think it, I mean, I almost didn't even realize that till I just kind of rediscovered that. But the man on the television is holding up a Bible. He held up a huge Bible and thrust it into the camera. It seemed to Carlotta that he had thrust it into her. So why is he using the Bible as a metaphor for her trauma? And I think that pretty much says it all. Like, I don't even really have to explain that because it's so brilliantly done. But in case anybody's wondering, she has religious trauma, religious sexual abuse trauma. And Frank De Felitta explores that a little bit. But what's interesting about the entity is that it's all kind of left up into the air. And when we get to the end, I'll just kind of tell you how it sort of fizzles out. I won't tell you every single detail here. But Carlotta's father was a minister, right? We have that right here. Who would have imagined that a minister's daughter from Pasadena would be happy banging out capital letters for the welfare board? Carlotta's trying to get a job working, at the welfare center as a secretary. Yet she was happy here. She liked the girls, the angular, blah, blah, blah. So, but her father was a preacher or a minister, right? Kind of weird. And then the entity starts showing up again, and he's growling. The entity is growling. And it manifests itself in some pretty strange ways. Now, I'm not sure if I should wait till we get to it or just briefly talk about it, but it starts out as like the entity is perceived as one male entity, right? And then towards the middle of the book, there's allusions to the fact that the entity might be Asian. She sees like slanted eyes and like a bald head. And then further on, even more disturbingly, the entity manifests itself as a group of dwarves, oddly enough, which is really, really weird. My brother's telling you guys about George Taylor Road. Yeah, definitely. My brother and I should probably do a conversation or a stream about our upbringing a little bit. Carla wondered why her mother waited until night to tend the roses. She only came back in when her father snored, a soft wheezing snore. She never went to bed when he was awake. She never went to bed when he was awake, nor did they speak. Their lives were as perfectly silent as the moonlight that glistened off the snails and the thorns. But it was in the gestures that they communicated. Sharp, erratic, nervous gestures, broken dishes, smashed glasses communicated some mysterious tension that ran like a river through the house, and somehow it was Carlotta's fault. Somehow the shadows all leaned on her, the silence folded on her, and the bitterness screamed inaudibly that it was her fault. And again, like, I'm rediscovering some of this now, and I annotated the shit out of this because, this was my first time reading it, but going back and reading it again, it all kinds of falls into place. And what is usually the worst perpetrator of a family sexual abuse? It's not necessarily one individual, right? But it's the denial, it's the silence of in a lot of cases, it's the mother or the father, but there's a sense of denial and a sense of that what's taking place is the child's fault, right? And that's how they keep these things kind of shoved under the rug, right? And it's actually quite tragic. It's a very emotionally tragic story, and it just kind of goes on and on and on. But we have some also references to the possible secret society or possible occult references. And it goes like this. Each Sunday they would meet. They're talking about Carlotta Moran and her husband and her father being a preacher. They would meet, and fashionable ladies and gentlemen, some of them famous, many of them rich, to perform in a ritual of perfect grace. Carla did not believe in it. It all seemed so false, yet she dared say nothing. Like, man, that's, damn, that's creepy. Some of them famous, some of them rich, to perform in a ritual of perfect grace. Carlotta did not believe in it. It all seemed so false, yet she dared say nothing. Now, what is she saying nothing about? Yeah, George Taylor Road, really creepy place. We had a lady that died in the dining room downstairs, and we had two brothers from like the 1800s at the turn of the century that shot each other because they were fighting over a girl or something like that. And then there's some other weird history out there. But you guys sort of understand, like, what he's getting at here. Late one night, she was awakened by their voices, resounding through the house. It frightened her. Never had such sounds ever beated through the immense rooms. Her father leaped from his desk and threw the black ledger, the financial ledger, at the gray wall. Or was it at her? What were they screaming about? What was a mortgage? What was a zoning law? Somehow he had done evil. It had to do with the black ledger. So there's something. Her father, Carla Moran's father, is involved in some kind of religious cult, but he's also involved in like backdoor dealings, maybe with the mayor or something like that. But there's famous people coming over, and it's weird that Frank De Villita, and that's why you kind of have to be maybe you could say beige to really understand this kind of stuff, because like it would fly over most people's head, but he's kind of like offering references to like secret societies and the kind of nefarious activities that they do. Then Carlotta's body began to change. She's undergoing puberty here. It was something she tried to prevent, but there was nothing she could do about it. Her chest grew tender, hair began to grow between her legs, and one day there was blood. She buried the underpants in the rose garden, but it happened again and then again. Just these beautiful descriptions of how Carlotta sort of becomes a woman. Then she has a sexual awakening. She kind of starts to learn about, self-pleasure. So like I said, like we talked about this element of sexual trauma and repressed sexuality, but it's also a story about a woman under strict religious circumstances sort of discovering her own sexuality apart from all the trauma she's received. We don't exactly know what took place with the trauma. I could be maybe reading into this entirely the wrong way, but I think that's what he's kind of getting at. And her parents like kind of shame her for having a period and stuff like that. Just some annotations I wrote down there. So they left the house temporarily. They moved in with one of their neighbors, and then they're kind of forced back into the house. And then she's driving her kids to school or something like that, and the entity attacks them in the car. The entity says, "Good morning, cunt." Their eyes fell past her neck, her shoulders, her chest, and hips. Hit her, poke her. So the entity is like basically, and that's how we get sort of the reference to there's maybe multiple entities, or one entity is communicating with somebody else, because Carlotta is hearing this very deranged voice that is threatening her to poke her and to hit her and to rape her and stuff. Drive her off the pier, they say. So they're trying to drive her off the road. Now, it's unclear, like in the actual research as well as the actual book by Frank De Villita, if this is even actually taking, I mean, we're led to believe that it's actually taking place, right? Because her kids start to see it. The car is veering off the road. She's got bruises on her legs. She's being assaulted. So there's an element of reality to it, but some of it, like, I think what it could also be is like mass hysteria within the family, which I know quite a bit about, not on this level, but as well as like Carlotta Moran is maybe a potential schizophrenic too, right? And all this is kind of taking place in her head, but she's convincing her children that this is all taking place, and maybe they're just kind of on board with it because it's interesting. It kind of reminds me of like when I was growing up, and my mom was convinced that we were being kind of belabored and stalked by these dark, Santeria forces. And, like there was a lot of it that was true, but some of it was maybe hysteria as well. And I think when a family is going through different struggles, they sort of bond. It's like the Salem witch trials or something. Everybody bonds over trauma, and they start to feed each other's delusions or something, right? So that's definitely a certain theme we could delve into. Then she's really depressed. She said, "I just want to die. I was raped, but what more is there to tell?" So basically the second part of the book, or the rest of the book, we see this character named Snyderman, and he's like the doctor. He's a psychologist, I think, or maybe a psychiatrist, but he works at the hospital, and he's a little more legitimate than Carrie Gaynor, like the guy we just saw. He's an actual psychologist. And he kind of takes Carlotta under his wing, and he develops an obsession with her because he can't really save her, but he really wants to save her, and he's never been married, he's never been laid. So there's a little bit of sexual attention there, perhaps. And he starts to work with his partner, and he's trying to analyze her. And they're sort of maybe being veered off in the wrong direction by their own ignorance. But they're also just, responding to what Carlotta Moran's telling them. He says, his next thought was psychosis. The hallucinations had been extreme, her delusion so complete that she must have lost contact with reality, but the longer she talked, the more she calmed down. Psychosis, schizophrenia usually show indications by the early 20s. Why now was it showing up at age 32? To be curing the broken and the twisted in a discipline he deemly respected under the best conditions, Snyderman, the image of his father came to mind. A shrunken, defeated man, the smell of cleaning fluid on his hands. So he's got a little bit of tension, family tension with his father. His father's kind of disappointed in him. And then Jerry Rodriguez, the original guy that got arrested, like that's Carlotta's boyfriend. And what's confusing about this book, but it's actually really compelling and brilliantly done, is that this book jumps back and forth in time. Like there's like basically the main plot, which is, or the main scenario, which is Carlotta in the present day living at the house with the kids being belabored by this creature. But in order to tell the history of Carlotta's emotions and her trauma, Frank De Felitta brilliantly does flashbacks, and he does it really well, and you don't even realize that you're kind of being jostled around the narrative, but that's how you find out more about Carlotta as well as the other characters, that he does flashbacks about her past, and he relates those memories that she's reliving and how they sort of manifest themselves or coalesce with what's taking place now. And then there's some tension with her son. Her son doesn't like her boyfriend. And then there's this other character named Franklin, and this opens up a whole nother can of worms. But he was kind of like this ne'er-do-well. Franklin, I think she was living in a different state at the time. And she had her first, I think she gave birth to Billy, her first son. And Billy is pretty much in the novel as like the helpless son, right? But he's also like this how do I say, like, he's like the catalyst for the sort of the mother-son tension. Like he's trying to pull his mother out of the depths of depravity and all these ne'er-do-wells she's hanging out with, but he's not really able to do that. And a lot of different relationships that are in Carlotta's past. Like I said, it's very dense. And then Franklin was killed on a motorcycle. But there, like I said before, with sort of the burgeoning or the during the sexual revolution and the pornographic magazines and the erotic horror, there is sort of an erotic element to Frank De Felitta's writing. He's constantly writing about what Carlotta's body looks like and how she feels, but it's brilliantly done and it's very tasteful. But you have to keep that in mind too. There is definitely the element of the erotic in terms of horror and stuff. But I would say he goes farther than most other writers, maybe except for Stephen King. I think this is better than Stephen King, really. But then the entity comes back. I want to start getting towards the tail end here. But basically, from Snyderman's point of view, he's the psychologist, right? There's the idea of he says here, most of the time it goes all the way back to infantile neurosis, something very basic. It may manifest itself in different ways, but it shows up in every relationship she's ever had. But they're kind of missing the point, right? The psychologists and the doctors are kind of missing the point because they don't really believe the entity exists. They believe it's all in her head. So basically, the infection spreads throughout the whole family. Like her kids start believing in the entity, and then Snyderman, the doctor, becomes more and more skeptical. And here's when the entity sort of says here. Let's see here. The shadow of the nostrils flared with delight at her cruel lips. The eyes were slanted, almond-shaped, bored through her, knew her carnally, knew everything about Carlotta. So what I suspect is, if the sexual trauma did not come from Carlotta's father, I think maybe what Frank De Felice is telling us is that one of the individuals that was in her father's religious cult, maybe this was one of those people. Or maybe there's another explanation, like Carrie Gaynor said, that the previous, trauma of the house that she's living in is kind of, maybe that entity just decided to latch on to Carlotta in addition to the sexual trauma that she's already had. And I think there's a level of truth to what he's getting at, is that traumatized people, I could maybe loosely say that they're the ones that are susceptible to this type of mass hysteria, right? But they're also spiritually susceptible to being attacked, because maybe they're vulnerable and they're weak, right? So that kind of makes sense, and that's really brilliant how he pulls that all together. Now, Snyderman basically claims that the whole entity is just a subconscious manifestation. Then we have some more time lapses. And basically, there's definitely this fear of men, from Carlotta's perspective, and that's sort of reiterated by Felita constantly. And then there's these scenes like out in the wilderness that kind of remind me of the Howling, where she's out living with this other guy in Twin Peaks. And then she gives birth to her second daughter, and that's just some other plot stuff going on here. So just a little bit about Carla Moran's heartbreak. And then we're getting towards the tail end here. And here's the weird part. It says, Carlotta, here's another attack by the entity. Carlotta felt a heavy sensation in her breast. She felt heavy all over, and she was inclined to stay in bed. Now there's a reference to the two dwarves here. Where is it? Okay. She hears laughter. Ha ha ha. Soft laughter, silken and confident. He was gone. She slowly turned her head. In the perfumed air, she saw at the foot of the bed two dwarfs, their eyes deep in impenetrable sockets, their long arms hanging, misshapen at their sides. They stood regarding her without a word. Carlotta felt hot and dizzy, her eyes glazed, watching them drop rose petals one by one onto her devastated legs. Sweet-smelling petals that gave off perfume. So that could be some type of occult stuff. I'm not sure why it's dwarves, but that's just really fucking disturbing to me. Let me know what you guys think about that. Who are the dwarves? Or the dwarves, like, it could also be just real quick flashes of what she remembers about when she was a child, too, and that's even creepier to me. Twin Peaks was weird. Yeah, there was also the show called Twin Peaks. And then Carlotta tries to give herself an abortion because she believes that that she's pregnant with the entity's, bastard, devilish creature, a bastard child from the entity. I forgot how she does it, but she tries to give herself this, really low quality abortion. There would be no baby, and she could continue to believe in this fantasy creature. He suddenly got an insight into the cleverness with which a psychosis operated. It flabbergasted him. He was going to question her gently now to find out how much this illusion meant to her. So she tried to abort the devil child, right? And then the other doctor that works over Snyderman basically says that, Snyderman, you're basically... pretty much everybody in this scenario is basically feeding her delusions, and they're trying to put an end to it. So basically, we're halfway through the novel here, and we'll kind of wrap it up shortly here. Appreciate you guys sticking around. Now, if anybody's read the entity or watched the movie, let me know how you would interpret it. How do you guys interpret that the entity? What is the entity exactly? And the book ends pretty sadly. But her friend basically wants to, and that's how she meets Carrie Gaynor, this character here.
We were experiencing the phenomena over and over again. Although some
That's how she meets that guy named Carrie Gaynor, and this is the photograph that was allegedly taken at the home. Is that her friend? She says you're not getting any solutions from these like psychologists or these psychiatrists. So why don't you go to see a medium or somebody like a parapsychologist or something? So they went to see a couple different people, and then some things fell through. But she was at a library looking at paranormal books or something, and that's kind of how allegedly she ran into these characters. Carrie Gaynor. Was one of the dwarves called Grumpy? Sorry, no, but that's pretty funny. But yeah, I just don't know why why dwarves? Like, that's just so disturbing. Poltergeist activity is usually correlated to certain emotional states: tension, hysteria, covert hostility, sibling rivalry. For example, I think you had better find out why she was seeing a psychiatrist. It had been 30 years. So then he goes on like another book's length about the history of Carrie Gaynor and Barry Taft. You've ignited my interest in reading these books. I really hope so. That's the end goal. I want you guys to kind of start reading. You don't have to read as many books as I do, but so basically, make a long story short, this documentary that we watched. It's basically what happens in the second half of the book, where Carrie Gaynor and Barry Taft, I think in the novel he's Barry Kraft and somebody else. I forgot what the similar names were, but they go to Carlotta's house and they start conducting this occult, esoteric, and from their perspective, they're not really delving into anything occult. I mean, they are, but it's like they're not doing it. They're doing it because they're genuinely interested in it, and they're trying to further they're trying to, I don't want to say rationalize. They want to legitimize the field of parapsychology and ghost investigations and stuff. So that's kind of why they're doing it. And then they'd start taking pictures, and that's kind of what he was talking about here. I wrote Christian Science reference. Here we go again, because this is probably the fifth or the sixth book where references to Christian Science. It says Mehan had been raised as a Christian Scientist. It was a religion that taught that the powers of the mind overcame those of the body. As a child, he used to test himself. He denied himself food, water, and he's subjugating himself to intense physical pain. So again, we have another reference to a secret society or a religious cult, Christian Science. There's a lot of famous people. Hell, even Bruce Hornsby was raised a Christian Scientist. Maybe that's how he became successful. Who knows? If you look into a lot of celebrities, you'll find that they were in Christian Science. Very weird. Okay, so we're going to close this out here shortly. Appreciate you guys hanging on for dear life, literally. So basically, her boyfriend Jerry, the guy that the novel started with, he was in jail in the beginning because they thought he assaulted her, but he really didn't. He was just trying to protect her. And he's probably one of the only positive, apart from all the people that are trying to help her. Jerry's like the best boyfriend she's ever had, right? But he doesn't really believe the entity until he kind of sees it, and Jerry starts to see it. So all of these, it's like Carrie Gaynor said, it couldn't just be mass hallucination. They're all seeing this, but how many people actually saw this? You have to remember too, like, this is a novel and he's writing it fairly convincingly, but I'm skeptical if, what actually took place, how much of it was embellished, and all that kind of thing. So, it's real, but it's not real. In the darkness, he saw Carlotta in the shadows. Her body was arced. He saw the pale glimmer of the sheet separate from her back as the soft skin rose as she moaned. So, and he says here she was sick. He knew now with a sickening feeling that he had to get her out of here. So and eventually she starts to, unfortunately, sort of starts to give in to the entity, and it seems that the entity is not necessarily assaulting her per se like he was initially. She sort of just starts to sort of submit to him, and there's like this weird other subplot of her like, you know, her repressed sexuality or something. And then Jerry gets arrested, as I said, and then basically they at UCLA, at the UCLA paranormal wing at the university. There's all this sort of tension between the dean and the parapsychology department because obviously they don't want to lose face, and the dean and the college officials basically don't want them to proceed with this occult, psyop, right? What they presume as an occult psyop. But Terry, Barry Taft and Terry Gaynor, whoever he calls them in the book, are basically pretty determined, and they basically set up a dummy, sort of a pseudo entity situation. They reconstruct Carlotta Moran's house in this giant laboratory, and they got her on surveillance, and they're trying to see if they can basically capture the entity, is what they're trying to do. And eventually they kind of capture the entity, or what they think was capturing the entity. But they fell short, and a bunch of the equipment kind of blew up and stuff like that. And then I'm trying to remember what happens here. I'm not going to tell you guys the full ending. Carlotta's mother shows up, which is kind of weird, and then all this stuff kind of happens with that. And then one of her ex-boyfriends comes up, and then basically we're pretty much at the end of the novel, and the book is closed now. I'm probably not going to read anything else from the text, but I do want to wrap up the last part of the book, the last significant part of it, and then I think my brother Charles is going to call so we can talk a little bit about the occult and hear what he has to say about certain things that we discussed. I should be done in like 5 minutes here, Charles, so you can call here in about 5 minutes. I just want to kind of wrap this up here for the viewers. But basically, Carlotta Moran is deemed a threat to herself, and she basically submits to the long-term care of Dr. Snyderman. And I'm not going to explain fully what that is because I want you guys to read the book. But that's pretty much, it's one of my other viewers made a video about the entity because she read it in like a couple of weeks, I think. She's my friend that, one of my YouTube acquaintances that has one of the original copies of it. But she said the book was pretty bleak, and it really is. That's a great way to kind of describe the entity, is that it's pretty bleak. It's not a happy ending. It's not a terrible ending, but it's pretty darn bleak. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of different ways you can interpret the entity. We could do a whole nother stream talking about the photographs and sort of that, all that kind of stuff that, allegedly took place. I think it makes for a very, very compelling, interesting story. But like I said, I'm not 100% convinced. Some of it definitely was maybe like the thumbnail of this video says, some type of occult paranormal psyop, but there could be some truth to it as well. Like maybe you guys could help me do some online sleuthing, and we could find out a little more about Doris Bither. Definitely makes for a fascinating story. That was a long one, wasn't it? Yeah, I mean, it's like Clarice says, like, it's definitely a lot of, they're trying to sell books too, right? And they do it brilliantly, but allegedly this was based on somewhat of a true story, but, they say that about a lot of things too, right? Based on a true story. Is the mic a little better tonight, guys? The microphone? I turned it down a little bit because it was just too loud. Hello? Hello?
Hey,
Hey, how's it going?
you look like you're worn out.
My throat is getting really dry all of a sudden, but
What were you drinking, Red Bull?
no, I'm just drinking a Corona and I'm drinking some water, but my throat is definitely getting dry from the all the talking, but it's pretty awesome.
My favorite segment, I think, is the entity, of course.
Right, yeah.
The the sightings clips. That the Ghost Report, I recommend everybody go and look up sightings, the Ghost Report, and watch that documentary if you want something super scary to watch.
Yeah, especially around this time of year too. It's like perfect timing.
It includes a lot more than just the entity segments too.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, what, like, do you have any particular thoughts, like, about the entity or about some of the other books that we? I mean, what are your thoughts on, or what is it you wanted to share as far as,
Well, like you said, even if some of it is not true, even if the whole thing is fabricated, the way those '90s film documentaries and stuff presented that information, they just did it in a way that like isn't done nowadays. Like, I don't know if anybody remembers, I mentioned this in the chat, but you remember the Travel Channel show that featured Robert the Doll?
Yeah, Weird Travels, I think it was called, or something like that.
Yeah, and, remember we found out about Elizabeth Bathory from, like, a History Channel show or something?
Yeah.
And they just don't make content like that anymore. But
Yeah.
as far as the entity goes, I mean, is it some sort of, like, weird psyop? I mean, the fact that the investigation came out of UCLA to
Right.
It's highly suspicious.
Yeah, yeah. I hope you learned a little bit about that case too, maybe that you didn't know before too.
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't know that the woman was, you said she was kind of struggling financially. She was raising all these kids by herself. I do think, sometimes a lot of single women they could be
Susceptible to hysteria.
either hysteria or legit, demonic attacks or,
Right.
Attacks from, the human material world. But
And I think we kind of maybe experienced a little bit of that growing up with mom sometimes too, It was a different situation, but it's just sort of the idea of a family that's vulnerable. Like when dad moved out, things got pretty bad for a while. Even spiritually, and I think that's, we kind of hit the nail on the head with that.
I was talking about this in the chat too. The energy of like our childhood home, I think, did kind of affects. It had effects. It caused maybe some family drama. Just the residual.
Yeah.
There, I don't know if it was ley lines or whatever you would call it. But a quick history of the house was. It was built in 1830, right, by a man named George Taylor. It was called George Taylor Road. The garage across the street used to be an old toll booth. Supposedly the road was also an old, like, Indian pathway.
Yeah, I remember that. It was like
Yeah.
a Indian path or something. Where they would get to green. I forgot how they described it. I think Ann Palermo told us about it. But
Lots of crazy legends. And then in the 70s or 80s, a woman's body was dumped in the swamp, like on that road, not too far from our home, maybe a mile up the road.
Yeah.
Then you had Mrs. Bennett, who owned the house before our parents bought it, and she was a dog trainer, but she was so weak in the last parts of her life, she couldn't go upstairs, and she ended up passing away in the dining room of the home. And remember, Mom and Dad said that when they bought the home, the upstairs had been, like, completely abandoned, and it was just like, I mean, imagine like the weeks and months it took to kind of clear some of that energy out.
Yeah, and some of it never left.
True. Well, I think with older homes and probably a lot of places in America and in Europe, that stuff kind of sticks around.
And do you remember?
Another thing I wanted to mention too is like I think you were talking about this with the first book. What was the first book called before the Howling?
Yeah, Haunting of Hill House.
Haunting of Hill House. That whole plot line reminds me of the Insidious movies where, where it's, the family or the victim will think it's the home that's haunted, but in reality, it's actually them. It's the family or it's an individual that these spirits have latched onto.
Yeah.
To me, that's even more sinister because, the deception of thinking, you can just leave a certain home and escape, and then months later in your new home these things start cropping up again. I mean,
And that was a theme in Shirley Jackson's book, was like unresolved trauma that they all carried with them to the Hill House.
And what do you think? I mean, there's also the element of like generational curses, generational trauma. I mean, some of the stuff you really have to work to kind of break. Um, whether that's because of genetics, passing down lines of, whatever, psychological disorders or addictions, or, kind of broken homes sort of foster more broken homes in future generations. But
Yeah.
there's that element too of the generational curses that I think, could be explored as well.
Yeah. What do you think about the idea that I was sort of delving into about, a lot of these horror writers, particularly the male ones, sort of maybe exploiting the erotic element to appeal to young male readers? Or do you think that was a thing? Or do you think that's a little bit of too much of a feminist interpretation? I mean, I think it's definitely worth exploring. I mean, these books came out, during the time when all those, really heightened sexual magazines were coming around, and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's definitely some parallels to be drawn there.
Absolutely, some parallels to be drawn there. The theme in a lot of like the Stephen King novels and a lot of these writers, it's
Stanley Kubrick.
There's like I guess the entity or the demonic force is kind of a lot of the times attacking the female character, or maybe possessing the male character, like in The Shining, but it's the female character that's like, really at some sort of, I guess, risk of harm. There's also this movie, it's kind of campy, but you might remember it, Contracted.
Oh yeah, that's a great one.
And it begins with, this girl at a party, and she's, drugged and assaulted, but she ends up with an STD that causes her to turn into a zombie. And there's a lot of really campy, gross scenes in the movie. Remember, like, the worms falling out?
Yeah.
But yeah, that does seem to be a theme in horror. And I don't know if that goes back to, like, a deeper, more ancient fear or something, or reality, whether that's Jack the Ripper or, probably going back further into medieval times,
Oh, yeah.
werewolves and vampires. Like vampires, a lot of the times, right, their victims are women, right? Dracula biting the necks of women, and, the vampires are very seductive. And so, yeah, there is definitely that element. I wonder if it does have any parallels to sort of the sexual revolution.
Yeah, like, I mean, if you watch
sexual degeneracy that was kind of promoted.
Yeah, remember when we watched the movie with Barbara Hershey? I mean, there's definitely an erotic element to that. Like, and they were obviously marketing that movie for a young male audience and stuff like that. So that's definitely a thing that they kind of defaulted into.
Even in like Hereditary, there's not necessarily an erotic or sexual element to it, but it's the wife, what's the actress's name?
Toni Collette.
Joni Collette, yeah, whatever her name is in the movie, she's the one that's pretty much like, possessed or attacked by the demonic forces. And there's also the aspect of the generational curse, right? Because her mother was in this evil cult. I think the cults too. Didn't you talk about that in The Entity? She was, what's that woman's name? She was in a religious cult.
Yeah, I mean, in every single book, they were kind of all part of cults, right? I mean, it just comes up. But yeah, like there was a religious cult my sort of thesis might be that she was sexually abused in some type of a religious cult, and that's sort of what
may have left her susceptible to like even spiritual.
Yeah, and
assaults.
It's very bleak, like I said, and she kind of ends up in like a mental institution or whatever with Snyderman, and Snyderman is like on like a real base level, he's simping really, really hard, and he basically like he takes care of Carlotta, and he has this repressed love for her, but he doesn't pursue any other women, but he basically is like the simp of the novel, but it sort of like manifests itself in like the dangers of trying to save the drowned, like avoiding the unhappy and the unlucky perhaps too. So there's some themes there, but yeah, like I definitely think. Yeah, but what I was going to say to you was that Frank De Felitta sort of like leaves everything open for interpretation, which I think is really great too. It's never.
I think even like going back further into medieval times, right? Isn't there that painting of like the hag or the goblin right on top of the woman in bed. You know, that old picture from, I don't know when it was painted, but you know, it could be sort of like an archetypal theme, you know, throughout human history, and who knows how long this kind of stuff has been going on.
Right.
But that was a very interesting stream.
Yeah, we got off to kind of a rough start with Haunting of Hill House, but by the time we got to the entity, the Haunting of Hill House is difficult, but I did the best I could with it.
You should do a stream, you know, kind of just watching the ghost report. I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, do you think we could tweak with that audio thing at some point? Like, it was pretty decent, but it's not quite the way it should be.
Yeah, when I come over, I'm going to try and figure it out on my computer here the next couple of days. I think we need to download a plug-in or something, an audio output plug-in. But
really?
When I come over Sunday, I'll try to take a look at that.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't bad. You could definitely hear the audio. Maybe try pointing the microphone or bringing one of the speakers closer to the microphone.
Yeah, I'll try that next time. The speakers were pretty far away.
Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate you stopping by. I'm going to answer one of these questions in the chat in a second.
Well, I'll go ahead and let you wrap it up.
All right.
Attend to the wifey. Marissa says hello to
All
everyone.
right. Marissa says hi, everybody.
And I'll talk to you soon.
All right. And just a note on my brother and Marissa. I would say half the chat already knows, like, they follow both of our content. But some of the people that came from my end of the pond, you know, feel free to check out my brother's channel as well as Marissa's. Maybe I can provide links so you guys can find him, but he's doing a lot of content. Vegan Cheetah, I think, is his main channel. And then Marissa has a channel called Sunset City where she does a lot of really interesting stuff about tarot cards and crystals, as well as just IRL vlogs and stuff like that. So it's all kind of part of our, social media universe that you guys might be interested in. I'm going to address Clarice's question here. She says, I have a question. Was she put under hypnosis during the investigation? This might have shown if she was experiencing was real or psychological. She put, definitely. Dr. Snyderman and, the parapsychologist, there's definitely some scenes where not necessarily psychosis, not necessarily hypnosis, but definitely things along those lines. Like they try to get her to close her eyes and sort of explain what she's feeling. So yeah, I actually my mother brought me to a hypnosis doctor one time. And he was kind of a quack, and like I was kind of baiting him because like I was kind of in hypnosis, but like I told him and he had me type on a computer and my eyes were closed, and he wanted me to kind of get in this sort of transcendental state where I would spill my guts, right? And I was kind of playing with him, but I sort of trusted him in the moment. Like I knew what he was doing was kind of like quackery, right? But I was playing ball with him, and I typed on the screen, it says, "There's a secret," right? and he goes, "Well, what's the secret?" And I said, "Well, as further the hypnosis went, I kind of kept baiting him about this secret, and all the secret was that when I was around that age, I had a really, really bad obsession with Jane Seymour, the actress, and that was like my secret, right? It was nothing really bad or creepy or anything like that, but that was like this one secret that I couldn't tell him, right? Like I was maybe gonna tell him eventually or something, but I ended up not going back to him, but like." That was going to be the dark secret, was my terrible, all-consuming obsession with this actress named Jane Seymour. But I was just kind of fucking with him, and I never actually told him what the secret was. But it was just kind of funny. Like, you can kind of bait people like that, psychiatrists and stuff like that. Yeah, that was a really good question. We have another question from Fiona here. Andrew, do you and Charles believe in the paranormal? Yeah, I mean, I would say to a certain extent. I would never claim, I've never seen a ghost. I certainly like to. Perhaps we'll see one tonight, as what's-his-face would say. But I saw the ghost of the dog at the Unitarian Church that we talked about. And that was pretty much the only... I mean, I would say it depends on what you mean by paranormal, right? Because... my mother was involved in Santeria as well as the occult, and there were some things that I saw within that universe that were definitely like in the realm of paranormal, or maybe in the realm of the occult, but they weren't necessarily paranormal. I wouldn't say I've experienced maybe 2 paranormal events. The first being seeing the flash of the ghost dog at the Unitarian Church. Maybe the fact that it was a Christmas Eve service at the main Memorial Unitarian Church. Maybe that just opened up the doors for weird things like that. And then also I was this was a long time ago when we lived in Syracuse, and we had like a TV room upstairs, and we had another TV room downstairs. Hold on one second. So, like, in the downstairs den, I was watching, I think Charles and I were, like, fucking around on YouTube one night or whatever, and we turned on, like, post-mortem photographs from the Victorian age, right? Some of you guys are probably very familiar with that. The Victorian age is we could do a whole stream on the Victorian era, but there was we were watching a YouTube video of just stills from the Victorian age, and all of a sudden we went to bed. I stopped the video. I closed out of the YouTube browser, right? But it was kind of in the wee hours of the morning, and all of a sudden I heard this music. I'm like, that music sounds awfully familiar. And I go downstairs into the computer room where we were watching that Victorian post-mortem video, and sure enough, that video was playing on the computer. And I think it was like kind of just some energies were a little bit out of whack, and maybe they were telling us not to, tread lightly on the, the souls of the people in the post-mortem photographs, or maybe it was a glitch on the computer, a paranormal glitch. But that video was playing, and I remember seeing it on the screen. I'm like, this is so weird. And I was scared because I felt like some energy in the room. But I just caught quietly, and I kind of heard it, and I was trying to ignore it because I was like, I had a feeling that something was going on downstairs in that room. But sure enough, that video somehow got back on this computer screen and started replaying by itself. So I would say that was maybe paranormal, or maybe it was just me being paranoid or something. But yeah, I've never really seen like the ghost of a human or something. I'd sure like to, but it is hard to hypnotize some people. Apparently you have to be a certain type of personality. Yeah, possibly. And I just don't like, the whole idea of hypnosis. It's just like, I don't know. It's kind of like pseudoscience, right? I mean, I would assume. It kind of goes into the realm of like, I don't even know what. But that was the Occult Literature live stream, guys. I hope you guys did enjoy it. We got some trolls in the chat. Shout out to the trolls making fun of my paintings. But we discussed all of these books here. We talked about The Haunting of Hill House, talked about The Howling, and then we did the last part of it was about the entity. Feel free to chime into the replay. I hope you guys will read these books. And I'm pretty wiped out. And that's probably where we're going to end this stream. If you have any last comments or questions, please let me know. If not, I'm going to get on out of here, try to relax a little bit, try to recenter. And now I'm all like, amped up with adrenaline and stuff like that. I've never felt completely comfortable in hypnosis. Me neither. Shout out to Clarice for staying up till, 4 o'clock in the morning over there in Spain. Really appreciate you. I'm glad you got to kind of see what we're doing over here. Do you read Lovecraft? He is spooky. Yeah, Lovecraft is really good. Actually, I haven't read him, but I assume he's good. He would be a really great choice. I'm going to jot his name down. Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft, yeah. He does a lot of like Egyptian stuff and stuff like that. But he's sort of like a more esoteric version of a more occult version of Edgar Allan Poe, perhaps. Yeah, I'll let you get to sleep, Clarice. Clarice, thank you so much for joining. We'll talk on Instagram. It was a good stream. Please do more. Have a great evening. You as well. Thank you so much, guys. Andrew Marlowe out.